The 20th century produced many explorers of the human mind, but few ventured as deeply into its hidden territories as Carl Gustav Jung. Born in Kesswil, Switzerland, on July 26, 1875, he would become not merely a psychiatrist treating the mentally ill, but a cartographer of the soul itself, mapping regions of human experience that scientific materialism had declared off-limits. His works resist simple categorization as either science or philosophy, for in Jung these supposed opposites achieve an uneasy unity. Through the concrete particulars of dreams, symptoms, and visions, he articulated universal patterns of meaning that continue to shape how we understand ourselves. Jung's early years foreshadowed the psychological explorer he would become. His father, Paul Achilles Jung, served as a Protestant pastor in rural Switzerland, a position that placed the family within respectable society while exposing young Carl to questions of faith that would haunt him throughout his life. The parsonage where he lived as a child bordered a cemetery, and death became a familiar presence in his imagination long before he understood its meaning. His mother, Emily Preiswerk, came from a family known for spiritualist interests and second sight, and she brought a stranger influence to the household. She spoke of visions, held seances, seemed at times to be two different people entirely. This early proximity to both religious doubt and mystical experience would leave permanent marks on his psychology. His father performed the rituals of Christianity while privately suffering what Carl perceived as a crisis of faith that Paul never acknowledged aloud. His mother withdrew into psychiatric illness when Carl was 3, an absence that left him with profound feelings of abandonment and a lasting distrust of the word love. The household carried secrets, unspoken tensions, a sense that what appeared on the surface bore little relation to what churned beneath. Carl learned early to read undercurrents, to sense what was not said, to trust his own perceptions, even when they contradicted the official version of reality that adults presented. He experienced from childhood what he would later recognize as a fundamental splitting of personality. One self was the schoolboy, the son of the poor country parson, awkward and inadequate in the social world. The other self was ancient, wise, connected to stones and nature and the 18th century, carrying a dignity that had nothing to do with his actual age or circumstances. This second personality felt more real than the everyday self, provided refuge from humiliation, and spoke in archaic phrases that seemed to come from somewhere beyond personal memory. Jung would spend his entire psychological career working to integrate what childhood had split, to bring conscious and unconscious into fruitful dialogue rather than dissociative alternation. At age 12, he experienced a vision so disturbing that he fought against it for days before allowing it to complete itself in his mind. He saw God seated on a golden throne high above the world, and from beneath the throne, an enormous turd fell upon the beautiful Basel Cathedral, shattering its roof and walls. The vision left him simultaneously terrified and exhilarated. He had expected divine punishment, but instead felt overwhelming grace, as if he had been initiated into a secret that conventional religion obscured. God was not the gentle figure of church teachings, but a power that encompassed destruction as well as creation, that could not be contained within human morality. This childhood world of doubles and depths, of religious forms emptied of numinous content, of a mother who seemed possessed, and a father dying by inches, would produce a psychology of the unconscious, of shadow and persona, of archetypes erupting from collective depths. Every concept Jung would later elaborate had its roots in this soil, in the boy who learned that the world visible to adults was not the only world, and that the interior life could be more real, more urgent than the conventions of everyday existence. Jung entered the University of Basel in 1895 to study medicine, a practical choice for a young man from an impoverished background who needed to earn a living and support his widowed mother and sister. He was drawn to science, to the empirical investigation of nature, yet he also harbored philosophical and humanistic interests that medical training did not fully engage. He studied anatomy, physiology, pathology, the hard sciences of the body and its mechanisms, while continuing to read voraciously in philosophy and comparative religion. He immersed himself in the works of Schopenhauer, whose pessimistic philosophy and emphasis on the will as the underlying reality resonated with Jung's sense that beneath the surface of consciousness lay deeper, driving forces. He explored Kant, particularly the Critique of Pure Reason, with its demonstration that human knowledge is structured by the categories of the mind rather than being a passive reception of reality as it is in itself. He encountered Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra while still a student, and the book shook him profoundly. Nietzsche's proclamation of the death of God, his emphasis on the will to power, his call for the Übermensch who would create his own values rather than accepting those handed down by tradition, all spoke to Jung's own sense that the Christianity of his father's generation had exhausted itself, and that new foundations for meaning would have to be discovered or created. Yet Nietzsche's fate also served as a warning. The philosopher's descent into madness in 1889, the final decade spent in darkness and incoherence, demonstrated the danger of inflation, of identifying too closely with the transpersonal forces one encountered, of losing the grounding in ordinary human reality that kept the exploration of the depths from becoming a dissolution into psychosis. During his medical studies, Jung experienced a series of paranormal phenomena that deepened his interest in what he would later call the psychoid unconscious, the level at which psyche and matter appeared to interpenetrate. A heavy walnut table in the family home split with a loud crack that sounded like a pistol shot, the wood separating radially from the centre, despite the dry environment that should have prevented such a split. 2 weeks later, a bread knife in a sideboard shattered into 4 pieces, the blade broken, although the knife had been lying undisturbed. Jung investigated, found no plausible physical explanation, and concluded that some form of psychic energy had discharged into the physical environment. His later concept of synchronicity, the causal connecting principle that linked psychic states with physical events through meaning rather than causation, had its origins in these puzzling occurrences. He also became involved with his young cousin Helene Preiswerk, who was serving as a medium in séances attended by Jung and other family members. Helene would enter trance states and channel various spirit personalities, claiming to communicate with the dead and to have knowledge of past lives. Jung observed these sessions with a combination of fascination and skepticism, recognizing genuine phenomena that could not be dismissed as mere fraud, while also suspecting that the spirits were not what they claimed to be, but rather fragmentary personalities, dissociated aspects of Helene's own psyche that had achieved autonomous existence. He would later write his medical dissertation on Helene's case, titling it On the Psychology and Pathology of So-Called Occult Phenomena, analysing the mediumistic trances as manifestations of dissociation and the spirit controls as personifications of unconscious complexes. This early work established several themes that would persist throughout Jung's career. First, that so-called occult or paranormal phenomena deserved serious investigation rather than a priori dismissal, that they often reflected genuine psychological processes even if they did not confirm the metaphysical explanations offered by spiritualists. Second, that the psyche was not unitary, but could fragment into multiple centres of consciousness, each with its own character, knowledge, and agenda. Third, that these autonomous complexes could possess considerable intelligence and creativity, producing knowledge and insights that the conscious ego did not possess, suggesting that the unconscious was not merely a repository of forgotten memories, but a source of genuinely new content. Fourth, that there existed a continuum between normal psychology, neurosis, and psychosis, that the mechanisms visible in extreme cases like Helen's mediumship operated in attenuated form in everyone, and that understanding pathology could illuminate normal functioning. As Jung neared the end of his medical studies, he faced the decision of what specialty to pursue. He had been leaning towards surgery, a field that offered status, income, and the appeal of direct intervention to cure disease. Then, while preparing for his final examinations, he encountered a textbook of psychiatry by Richard von Krafft-Ebing, a German-Swiss psychiatrist known for his work on sexual pathology. The preface struck Jung like a revelation. Krafft-Ebing described psychiatry as a field where the biological and the spiritual met, where diseases of the personality demanded understanding of both body and soul, where the physician had to engage not merely with organs and tissues, but with the totality of the human being. Jung realized in that moment that psychiatry offered the possibility of uniting his scientific and humanistic interests, of working at the frontier where empirical investigation confronted questions of meaning, subjectivity, and the unknown dimensions of the psyche. He accepted a position at the Burg Hölzli Mental Hospital in Zurich, beginning his psychiatric training in December 1900 under the directorship of Eugen Bleuler, one of the most progressive and innovative psychiatrists in Europe. Bleuler had introduced the term schizophrenia to replace the older label dementia praecox, emphasizing that the core disturbance involved a splitting or fragmentation of psychological functions rather than inevitable deterioration. He insisted that schizophrenic patients should be treated with respect and attentiveness, that their symptoms had psychological meaning rather than being merely random products of brain disease, and that the boundary between normal and pathological was less rigid than conventional psychiatry assumed. The Burg Hölzli provided Jung with a laboratory for the intensive study of the unconscious in its most dramatic and disturbing manifestations. He worked with patients whose grip on consensus reality had dissolved, who heard voices commanding them to act, who believed themselves to be Jesus Christ or Napoleon or the victim of elaborate conspiracies, whose thought processes had become fragmented and inaccessible to ordinary logic. He learned to listen to their delusions and hallucinations not as meaningless noise, but as symbolic expressions of psychological content that could not be communicated directly. He spent hours talking with patients, recording their statements, trying to discern the patterns and themes that organize their seemingly chaotic productions. One patient, a woman with paranoid schizophrenia, declared that she was pregnant with the Saviour, and that the other patients were persecuting her because of her holy mission. Jung recognized in her delusion a compensatory fantasy, an inflation of the self that arose in response to an underlying sense of worthlessness and abandonment. The religious imagery was not arbitrary, but drew on archetypal patterns of divine birth, virgin motherhood, persecution of the Holy One, themes that recurred across cultures and mythologies. Her psychosis represented an extreme version of processes observable in less dramatic form in neurotic patients, and indeed in normal individuals during times of crisis, when the ego's defenses collapsed and unconscious contents erupted with overwhelming force, demanding recognition through symptom and delusion. Jung developed the word association test as a research method for detecting and measuring unconscious complexes. The procedure was simple. The experimenter read a list of stimulus words one at a time, and the subject responded with the first word that came to mind. The researcher measured response time and noted unusual reactions: delayed responses, repetition of the stimulus word, odd or emotionally charged associations, failure to recall one's response in a subsequent trial. Jung discovered that delays and disturbances clustered around certain words, indicating that those words had activated an emotionally toned complex, a constellation of associated images, memories, and affects that interfered with the smooth functioning of consciousness. For example, A patient who responded quickly and neutrally to most words might show a marked delay and emotional reaction to words like mother, guilt, or punishment, suggesting a complex related to maternal relationship and moral transgression. The complex operated as a kind of autonomous splinter psyche, a fragmentary personality with its own emotional core that could momentarily seize control of consciousness and distort perception, memory, and association. These complexes were not pathological in themselves, but a normal feature of psychic structure, present in everyone, becoming problematic only when they were particularly intense, unconscious, and prone to overwhelming ego consciousness. Jung recognized that Freud had independently discovered similar phenomena under the term repression, and he began to study Freud's work with intense interest. Freud's interpretation of dreams, published in 1900, argued that dreams were disguised wish fulfillments, that they represented forbidden impulses and desires that had been repressed from consciousness but continued to seek expression through the symbolic transformations of dream work. Jung found Freud's approach both brilliant and limited. He agreed that dreams expressed unconscious contents and that sexual complexes played a significant role in neurosis. He disagreed that all dreams were merely wish fulfillments, that sexuality was the primary drive underlying all psychological phenomena, and that the unconscious was exclusively personal, consisting only of repressed material from the individual's own history. Jung published his findings on the word association test and sent copies of his papers to Freud in Vienna. A correspondence began in 1906, tentative at first, then increasingly warm and intense. Jung saw in Freud a thinker of revolutionary courage who had broken through the respectable silences surrounding sexuality, who had insisted that neurotic symptoms had psychological meaning, and who had developed a method of investigation that took seriously the patient's subjective experience. Freud saw in Jung a gifted researcher from a prestigious Swiss academic setting who could help legitimate psychoanalysis, which was largely dismissed in Vienna as a Jewish science dealing with unsavory sexual topics. Freud was acutely aware that psychoanalysis needed representatives from the wider European intellectual world if it was to gain acceptance beyond the small circle of Viennese analysts, and Jung, Swiss, Protestant, academically credentialed, seemed providentially suited to play that ambassadorial role. The two men met for the first time in March 1907 in Vienna. The meeting lasted 13 hours, a marathon conversation in which they discussed case material, theory, technique, the resistance psychoanalysis faced from the medical establishment, and their own experiences of the unconscious. Jung felt he had found a father figure, a mentor who understood the territories he was exploring, who had the intellectual breadth and courage to follow the implications of the unconscious wherever they led. Freud felt he had found a son, an heir, someone who could carry the psychoanalytic movement forward into the next generation and into the non-Jewish world. The psychological dynamics that would eventually tear them apart were already present in this initial meeting, in the father-son structure of the relationship, in Jung's need to establish his own identity separate from Freud's overwhelming influence, in Freud's need for loyalty and agreement that would become intolerable to someone of Jung's independent temperament. For the next several years, Jung threw himself into psychoanalytic work, defending Freud's theories against critics, applying Freudian concepts to his own clinical practice, corresponding extensively with Freud on theoretical and personal matters. He conducted research on schizophrenia using psychoanalytic methods, arguing that even the most seemingly incomprehensible psychotic symptoms had meaning if one understood the complex that had been activated. He edited the Yearbook for Psychoanalytic and Psychopathological Research, served as the first president of the International Psychoanalytical Association, and became Freud's most prominent and respected disciple. Yet even during these years of collaboration, differences emerged that would prove impossible to reconcile. Jung could not accept Freud's insistence that libido was exclusively sexual energy, that all neurotic symptoms ultimately traced back to sexual trauma or conflict, and that the Oedipus complex, the child's sexual desire for the opposite sex parent and murderous rivalry with the same-sex parent, was the nuclear complex of all neurosis. Jung's clinical experience suggested that libido was a more general term for psychic energy, that it could attach to many objects and take many forms, only one of which was sexuality. He saw in his patients religious longings, spiritual aspirations, quests for meaning and wholeness that could not be reduced to sublimated sexual drives. He noted that many neuroses arose not from sexual repression, but from failure to find purpose and significance in life, from spiritual emptiness, from inability to adapt to the demands of adulthood. Jung also chafed at what he perceived as Freud's dogmatism, the treatment of psychoanalytic theory as revealed truth rather than provisional hypothesis, subject to revision based on new evidence. Freud spoke of psychoanalysis in quasi-religious terms as a cause requiring disciples who would remain faithful to its core tenets, and he reacted strongly against anyone who proposed significant modifications to the theory. He had already expelled Alfred Adler from the psychoanalytic circle for emphasizing the will to power and inferiority feelings over sexuality. Jung sensed that he, too, was expected to subordinate his own clinical observations and theoretical intuitions to Freudian orthodoxy, and the more he was pushed toward conformity, the more he resisted. A key moment in the deteriorating relationship occurred during a joint trip to America in 1909, when both men had been invited to lecture at Clark University in Massachusetts. They spent time together on the ocean voyage, analyzing each other's dreams as a way of deepening their personal bond. Freud shared a dream, and Jung asked for more details about Freud's personal life to properly interpret it. Freud refused, stating that he could not risk his authority. Jung later wrote that in that moment, Freud lost his authority completely for him, because authority based on secrecy and the refusal to submit to the same processes one demanded of patients and students was no authority at all, but merely power. The incident revealed the asymmetry in their relationship. Freud's need to remain the father figure, who analyzed others but was not analyzed. Jung's need for genuine dialogue between equals rather than submission to patriarchal authority. Jung's years at the Burghölzli and his collaboration with Freud gave him the clinical foundation and theoretical framework he would need for his later independent work. From Bleuler and the Burghölzli, he learned that the most disturbed patients were not beyond understanding, that psychosis revealed in magnified form processes present in everyone, and that symptoms had meaning if one had the patience and insight to decipher them. From the word association experiments, he confirmed the existence of autonomous complexes, fragmentary personalities with emotional cores that could interfere with consciousness and produce the strange disturbances of thought, memory, and behavior observed in both neurotic and normal individuals. From Freud, he learned that the unconscious was not a philosophical abstraction, but a dynamic reality that could be investigated empirically, that sexuality played a crucial role in psychological life, that dreams and symptoms were meaningful communications from the unconscious, and that transference, the patient's projection of unconscious contents onto the therapist, was central to therapeutic work. Yet he also learned the limits of Freudian theory, its reductionism, its dogmatism, its inability to accommodate spiritual and religious dimensions of experience, its overemphasis on childhood trauma and sexual etiology. He recognized that Freud's psychology was essentially a psychology of neurosis, focused on pathology and its resolution, whereas Jung increasingly felt drawn toward a psychology of development across the lifespan, including the second half of life, when questions of meaning and mortality became urgent, and a psychology of wholeness that included not only the resolution of symptoms, but the realization of the self, the hidden totality that transcended ego consciousness. The break with Freud would be painful, would cost Jung his position in the international psychoanalytic movement, and would plunge him into years of isolation and inner turmoil. But it would also liberate him to follow his own vision, to develop a psychology that could encompass both the personal and the transpersonal, both the shadows of the past and the call of the future, both the pathology of consciousness and the creativity of the unconscious. The relationship between Freud and Jung has become one of the legendary partnerships in the history of ideas, compared to the collaborations and ruptures between Marx and Engels, Nietzsche and Wagner, or any two thinkers whose alliance promised to reshape a discipline before personal and theoretical differences tore them apart. For 6 intense years, from their first meeting in 1907 to the final break in 1913, these two explorers of the unconscious circled each other in a dance of mutual fascination, paternal expectation, and filial rebellion, intellectual exchange and emotional intensity that would leave both men transformed and the landscape of depth psychology permanently altered. Freud was 51 when he met Jung, established in Vienna with a small but devoted circle of followers. Embattled by the medical establishment that dismissed psychoanalysis as unscientific speculation about unsavory sexual topics, he had published The Interpretation of Dreams, 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, and numerous case studies including Dora and Little Hans. He had developed the core concepts of psychoanalysis, the unconscious as repository of repressed wishes, the pleasure principle and reality principle, the Oedipus complex as the nuclear neurosis, infantile sexuality and its stages, repression and resistance, transference and countertransference, the dream as disguised wish fulfillment. He was supremely confident in the truth of his discoveries, yet also acutely aware that psychoanalysis faced an uncertain future, identified with Jews and sexual obsession, excluded from academic respectability. Jung was 32, brilliant, ambitious, already making a name for himself through his work on word association and schizophrenia, positioned at the prestigious Berg-Hölzli Clinic, part of the Swiss medical establishment that Freud could never penetrate. He brought to Freud not only his own considerable clinical and research skills, but also the imprimatur of Gentile European psychiatry, the possibility that psychoanalysis could transcend its provincial Viennese origins and become a truly international movement. Freud needed Jung, perhaps more than Jung needed Freud, though initially Jung's need for a father figure and intellectual mentor was intense enough to blind him to the asymmetries and future conflicts embedded in their relationship. Their correspondence reveals the evolution of their bond. In the early letters, Jung is deferential, addressing Freud with formal honorifics, asking for guidance, defending Freud's work against critics, while seeking reassurance that his own modifications and extensions remain within psychoanalytic orthodoxy. Freud responds with avuncular warmth, praising Jung's gifts, encouraging his research, gradually revealing more of his personal thoughts and feelings. By 1908, the tone has become intimate, even fervent. Freud explicitly anoints Jung as his heir and successor, referring to him as the Joshua who will lead psychoanalysis into the promised land after Freud, like Moses, has glimpsed it from afar but cannot enter himself. The father-son dynamic deepened during their face-to-face meetings. Freud dominated conversations through sheer force of personality, intellectual agility, and the weight of his prior discoveries. Jung found himself in the position of the acolyte, absorbing the master's teachings, subordinating his own intuitions to Freud's framework, experiencing both the exhilaration of being close to genius and the subtle frustration of having his autonomy constrained. Freud, for his part, enjoyed having a strong and gifted son figure to nurture and eventually to inherit his legacy. Yet he also needed Jung to remain loyal, to not deviate too far from core psychoanalytic principles to represent Freudian theory, rather than develop an independent vision that might supplant or rival it. The first significant friction arose over Jung's 1911 book Wandlungen und Symbole der Libido, published in English as Psychology of the Unconscious, and later revised as Symbols of Transformation. In this work, Jung analysed the fantasies of a young American woman, Miss Frank Miller, who had recorded a series of elaborate mythological images and poetic productions that seemed to emerge spontaneously from her unconscious. Jung compared her material with myths, religious texts, and fairy tales from cultures around the world, demonstrating that her individual fantasies paralleled universal human motifs: the night sea journey, the hero's descent into the underworld, transformation and rebirth, the divine child, the terrible mother. This method of amplification, of placing individual psychological material in dialogue with collective cultural parallels, would become central to Jungian technique. But it also implied something that contradicted Freudian theory. Jung argued that Miss Miller's fantasies could not be adequately explained as disguised personal wishes or childhood memories. They drew on a layer of the psyche deeper than personal experience, a collective stratum containing universal patterns and images that Jung called primordial images and would later term archetypes. This collective unconscious was not acquired through individual experience, but was inherited, part of the structure of the human brain itself, carrying the cumulative psychic heritage of human evolution. Libido, in this context, could not be merely sexual energy, but must be understood as undifferentiated psychic energy capable of attaching to many objects and taking many forms, only one of which was sexuality. The mother complex, so central to Freudian theory, was not simply a matter of the individual's relationship with his or her personal mother, but activated an archetypal image of the Great Mother, a transpersonal pattern that structured human experience of the feminine across cultures and epochs. These ideas struck at the foundations of Freudian psychoanalysis. If libido was not primarily sexual, if the unconscious contained not only repressed personal material, but also inherited collective patterns, if myths and religious symbols had autonomous psychological validity rather than being sublimations of sexual impulses, then the entire edifice of Freudian theory required fundamental revision. Jung knew as he wrote Symbols of Transformation that he was crossing a Rubicon, that this book would place him outside Freudian orthodoxy and probably cost him his relationship with Freud. He experienced the writing as agonizing, feeling that he was betraying the father while simultaneously knowing that he had to follow his own vision wherever it led, that intellectual integrity required him to report what he had observed, even if it meant isolation and exile from the psychoanalytic movement. Freud's response was measured at first, but his underlying anxiety and disappointment showed through. He wrote to Jung expressing concern about the book's direction, worried that Jung was abandoning the sexual etiology of neurosis, reverting to the kind of mystical speculation that psychoanalysis had overcome through rigorous empirical investigation. He reminded Jung of the importance of maintaining the hard-won insights that distinguished psychoanalysis from the vaguer psychologies that preceded it. He suggested that Jung's deviations might reflect unresolved personal issues, a resistance to confronting his own Oedipus complex, a flight from the uncomfortable truths about sexuality that Freud had uncovered. This interpretation of theoretical disagreement as personal pathology enraged Jung. It exemplified precisely what he found intolerable in Freud's approach, the assumption that anyone who disagreed with Freudian theory must be resisting out of neurotic defensiveness rather than offering legitimate alternatives based on different clinical observations and philosophical premises. Jung did not deny that sexual complexes existed or that childhood experiences shaped adult personality. He denied that sexuality explained everything, that all roads led back to the Oedipus complex, and that the richness of human symbolic and religious life could be adequately understood as sublimated or disguised sexuality. He had his own empirical findings, his own case material, his own confrontation with the unconscious, and they pointed toward conclusions that Freud could not accommodate within his system. Personal tensions compounded the theoretical divisions. Jung had married Emma Rauschenbach in 1903, a union that brought financial security and social stability, but also conventional bourgeois expectations that chafed against Jung's need for freedom and his powerful erotic nature. He became involved with several of his patients, most significantly with Sabina Spielrein, a Russian Jewish woman who had been hospitalized at the Burghölzli with severe hysteria and whom Jung treated with psychoanalytic methods. The relationship evolved from therapeutic to romantic to intensely complicated, involving projection and counter-projection, transference and counter-transference, genuine passion and professional boundary violations. Jung eventually ended the affair, but it left both participants wounded and confused. Spielrein became an analyst herself, studied with Freud in Vienna, and contributed original ideas to psychoanalytic theory, including the concept of the death instinct that Freud would later appropriate and develop. She corresponded with Freud about her relationship with Jung, and Freud used her confidences to gather information about Jung's personal life and character. The triangulation of Freud, Jung, and Spielrein added personal betrayal and voyeurism to the intellectual tensions already straining the Freud-Jung relationship. Jung felt that Freud had exploited Spielrein's disclosures to gain leverage over him, while Freud felt that Jung's sexual acting out with patients demonstrated a lack of self-control and ethical judgment that raised questions about his suitability for leadership in the psychoanalytic movement. Another source of conflict involved Freud's attitudes towards spirituality and religion, which Jung found reductionistic and dismissive. Freud treated religious belief as illusion, as neurotic projection rooted in infantile helplessness and the need for a protective father figure. He saw civilization as built on the repression of instinctual drives, saw guilt and superego as internalized parental prohibitions, saw all higher cultural achievements as sublimations of sexual energy. There was no room in Freud's system for the numinous as an autonomous psychological reality, for the self as anything more than successful ego adaptation, for symbols as pointing toward transcendent meaning rather than merely disguising forbidden wishes. Jung encountered patients, particularly in the second half of life, whose problems had nothing to do with sexuality or unresolved childhood conflicts, but everything to do with absence of meaning, loss of connection to something larger than ego concerns, failure to address the spiritual questions that became urgent with the approach of mortality. He saw religious symbols as genuine manifestations of the collective unconscious, as expressions of archetypal patterns that carried their own validity independent of whether they corresponded to metaphysical truths. He believed that the psyche naturally produced religious imagery, and that attempts to dismiss or reduce this tendency resulted in spiritual impoverishment and psychological symptoms. The conflict between Freud's scientific materialism and Jung's openness to the numinous reflected fundamentally incompatible worldviews: empirical reductionism versus symbolic realism, causal mechanistic explanation versus teleological purposive understanding. The final rupture occurred gradually over 1912 and 13 through increasingly acrimonious letters, hurt feelings, accusations of betrayal, and public criticisms. Jung resigned from his position as president of the International Psychoanalytic Association. He withdrew from editing the yearbook. Freud and Jung ceased correspondence. The The psychoanalytic community fractured, with some analysts following Jung into what would become analytical psychology, while others remained loyal to Freud. The break devastated both men emotionally, though neither would fully acknowledge the depth of the wound. Freud thereafter treated Jung as a heretic and traitor, referring to him with bitterness in letters and conversations. Jung struggled with feelings of guilt and loss, recognizing that he had destroyed a relationship with a man he loved and admired, even as he felt compelled to establish his own theoretical independence. The break was not merely personal or temperamental, but reflected genuine theoretical incompatibilities rooted in different life experiences, philosophical commitments, and clinical observations. Freud had discovered the personal unconscious, the repository of repressed infantile wishes, traumatic memories, and forbidden desires unique to each individual's history. Jung would discover the collective unconscious, the inherited layer of the psyche containing universal archetypes and mythological motifs common to all humans. Freud developed a psychology of neurosis centered on symptom formation, repression, and the conflicts of childhood. Jung would develop a psychology of individuation spanning the entire lifespan, focused on the integration of consciousness and unconsciousness toward wholeness. Freud's libido was sexual energy at root, seeking discharge and satisfaction. Jung's libido was undifferentiated psychic energy, capable of assuming many forms. Freud was primarily a causal reductive thinker, explaining present conditions by tracing them back to earlier causes, particularly childhood trauma and Oedipal conflicts. Jung was primarily a teleological synthetic thinker, understanding psychological processes as oriented toward future goals and the realization of latent potentials, particularly the self. Freud's therapeutic aim was to make the unconscious conscious, to strengthen ego control over ID impulses, to achieve realistic adaptation to the demands of society. Jung's therapeutic aim was individuation, the differentiation and integration of the personality, the establishment of a living relationship between ego and self, the realization of one's unique potential. Both psychologies addressed real phenomena. Both offered genuine insights, but they were attempting to map different territories and using fundamentally different cartographic principles. For Jung personally, the break with Freud precipitated a crisis that would become the most creatively fertile and psychologically dangerous period of his life. Having staked his reputation and career on an alliance with Freud, having risen to prominence within the psychoanalytic movement, having enjoyed the security of belonging to an international circle of like-minded researchers, he now found himself isolated, professionally marginalized, personally adrift. He had rejected the father and had no clear alternative foundation to stand on. He knew what he disagreed with in Freudian theory, but he had not yet fully articulated his own positive vision. He experienced disturbing dreams and visions, felt overwhelmed by unconscious contents he could barely contain, sensed that he was approaching the edge of sanity and might topple into the psychosis he had studied in others. What followed would be his confrontation with the unconscious, the descent into the underworld, the night sea journey from which he would emerge with the core insights of analytical psychology. But that emergence was not guaranteed, and there were moments when Jung felt he was losing his grip on reality entirely, dissolving into the same chaos he had observed in schizophrenic patients at the Berg Hölzli. In December 1913, Jung experienced the first of a series of visions that would continue for several years, plunging him into what he would later call his creative illness, his descent into the unconscious, his encounter with the archetypes in their most raw and overwhelming form. He was travelling by train, alone with his thoughts, when suddenly an image seized him with hallucinatory vividness. He saw all of Europe inundated by a catastrophic flood, bodies floating, buildings collapsing, civilization dissolving into chaos. The North Sea rose up and covered the land from England to the Alps. The waters were transformed into blood, and the vision was accompanied by an overwhelming sense of dread and catastrophe. Jung struggled to understand what this meant, wondering whether he was losing his mind, whether he was on the brink of psychotic break. The vision repeated 2 weeks later, even more intense, even more frightening. This time he saw not only the flood, but also a voice that spoke to him, saying, "Look at it. It is completely real, and it will come to pass." The sense of impending doom was so overwhelming that Jung spent the next months in a state of psychological emergency, unsure whether the visions represented his own impending psychosis or some kind of precognition of a collective catastrophe. Then, in August 1914, World War I erupted across Europe. The flood he had seen was not personal madness, but a symbolic anticipation of the collective insanity about to engulf an entire continent. His personal unconscious had somehow accessed the collective psyche, sensing the tensions and hatreds gathering beneath the surface of civilized Europe, expressing in symbolic form the coming outbreak of mass violence and destruction. Jung realized that if he was to understand these visions, if he was to avoid being overwhelmed by the forces that had erupted into his consciousness, he would need to engage the unconscious deliberately, to turn toward it rather than away, to enter into dialogue with the images and figures that emerged from the depths. He embarked on a method he called active imagination, allowing fantasies to unfold while maintaining ego awareness, observing and even conversing with the figures that appeared without collapsing into passive identification with them. This required a precarious balance, loosening conscious control enough to let unconscious contents emerge while retaining sufficient ego strength to not be swept away by them. The technique would become one of the central methods of Jungian analysis, a way of accessing unconscious material more directly than through dreams while avoiding the loss of critical distance that characterizes psychosis. He began to record his visions, dreams, and active imaginations in a series of notebooks, elaborately illustrated manuscripts that he later transcribed into a large red leather volume that came to be known as the Red Book or Liber Novus, New Book. The Red Book remained unpublished during Jung's lifetime, kept in a bank vault, shown only to a few trusted colleagues and students. He considered it too personal, too raw, too liable to be misunderstood as the ravings of a madman rather than a disciplined exploration of the collective unconscious. The book was finally published in 2009, 99 years after Jung began the work, allowing readers to see the source material from which his mature psychology emerged. The Red Book is not a theoretical treatise, but a visionary narrative, part autobiography, part myth, part psychodrama. It begins with Jung's soul speaking to him, calling him to abandon the conventional world and descend into the depths. He resists, arguing that he has responsibilities, a family, a career, social obligations. The soul insists that he must follow, that the way to the depths is the way forward, that he will find nothing by remaining on the surface. Jung finally surrenders and begins the descent, finding himself in a series of archetypal landscapes, deserts, caves, forests, encountering figures who embody different aspects of the unconscious. One of the earliest and most significant figures he encounters is Elijah, an old prophet accompanied by a young woman named Salome and a large black serpent. Elijah represents wisdom, logos, the capacity for insight and understanding. Salome represents eros, blind relatedness, the power of desire and attachment. The serpent represents instinct, the chthonic force that connects human beings to the earth and to their animal nature. This triad embodies fundamental aspects of the psyche, thought and feeling, spirit and matter, sight and blindness. Jung converses with Elijah, seeking guidance, trying to understand the meaning of his visions. Elijah tells him things that shock and disturb him, challenging his conscious assumptions, revealing perspectives that ego consciousness finds unacceptable. Then Elijah transforms into Philemon, another old man, this one with the wings of a kingfisher, pagan rather than biblical, connected to ancient Hellenistic wisdom rather than Judeo-Christian prophecy. Philemon becomes Jung's primary inner guide, a figure who represents the autonomous wisdom of the unconscious, who seems to have knowledge independent of Jung's own conscious mind, who speaks with authority and insight that Jung himself does not possess. Jung treated Philemon as utterly real, walked with him in his garden, engaged in lengthy conversations, attributed to him thoughts and perceptions that seemed to come from an other within. This was not psychosis because Jung never lost the awareness that Philemon was a psychological reality rather than an external entity. Yet Philemon was also not merely a product of Jung's conscious imagination, but an autonomous manifestation of the self, the archetype of wisdom and totality that transcended ego consciousness. Through Philemon, Jung learned that the psyche produces thoughts just as the body produces physical objects, that psychic images are autonomous realities with their own existence and intentionality, that the ego is not the center or creator of consciousness, but merely one complex among others within a larger psychic system. Philemon taught Jung that the psyche is objective, that inner figures have their own life and reality, that one must relate to them with the same seriousness and respect one would offer to persons in the outer world. This realization became foundational for Jung's mature psychology, the understanding that the unconscious is not a passive repository waiting to be interpreted by consciousness, but an active, creative source that produces images, insights, and perspectives that consciousness does not generate and cannot fully control. Other figures appeared in Jung's visions, some beautiful and benevolent, others terrifying and destructive. He encountered the devil, engaged in dialogues about good and evil, learned that evil could not be dismissed or denied but had to be integrated, that the light and the dark were both necessary aspects of wholeness. He saw himself as Christ crucified, experienced inflation as he identified with the archetype of the self, felt his ego dissolving into transpersonal forces that threatened to annihilate him. He learned through bitter experience the danger of archetypal identification, the catastrophe that occurs when the small ego mistakes itself for the vast powers it encounters, when one confuses oneself with the God one has discovered within. The task was not to become the God, but to relate to the God, to maintain ego integrity while acknowledging one's subordination to the larger psychic totality. He witnessed scenes of sacrifice and transformation, experienced himself dying and being reborn, saw the mythological motifs of dismemberment and reconstitution that appear in shamanic initiations and ancient mystery religions. He realized that these were not merely personal experiences, but enactments of universal patterns, that his individual journey recapitulated the hero's quest described in mythologies worldwide, that his confrontation with the unconscious was at once uniquely his and participation in a collective human process. The personal and transpersonal interpenetrated, his individual suffering and transformation connected him to the suffering and transformation of all who had undertaken the journey of individuation, known by different names in different cultures, but essentially the same process of death and rebirth, descent and return, loss and recovery at a higher level of integration. Jung experienced periods of profound disorientation during these years, uncertain whether what he was undergoing was pathology or initiation, breakdown or breakthrough. He continued to see patients, maintained his professional responsibilities, functioned in the ordinary world while privately engaged in experiences that would have been diagnosed as psychotic had they occurred in someone without his ego strength and clinical sophistication. He was acutely aware of the parallel between his own state and that of his former patients at the Burg Hölzli, the difference being that he retained sufficient distance to observe what was happening, to record it, to extract meaning from it rather than being passively overwhelmed. He was wading in the same waters in which the psychotic patient drowns, but he was able to keep his head above water, to swim rather than sink, to navigate by the archetypes rather than being dragged under by them. His family life provided an anchor, a connection to ordinary reality that prevented complete dissolution. His wife Emma, his children, his home in Küsnacht on the shore of Lake Zurich, all served as reminders that he belonged to the daylight world as well as the world of visions and archetypal encounters. He continued his medical practice, though on a reduced scale. He devoted himself to building a stone structure at Bollingen, a tower that would become his private retreat, a physical manifestation of his work of psychological construction. The tower grew organically over decades as Jung added sections and levels in response to inner prompts, creating in stone a representation of the individuation process itself, a temenos, or sacred precinct where the work of integration could unfold. The Red Book period taught Jung several lessons that became central to his mature psychology. First, that the unconscious is not merely personal, but collective, containing archetypal patterns and images that transcend individual experience. Second, that these archetypes manifest as autonomous figures with their own characteristics and intentions, that they can be encountered and related to through active imagination and other techniques. Third, that the ego must not identify with archetypal contents, but must maintain its own integrity while acknowledging its subordination to the larger self. Fourth, that symbols are not arbitrary signs, but living realities that connect consciousness to the unconscious, that carry energy and meaning between the two realms. Fifth, that individuation is a dangerous journey requiring courage, honesty, and the ability to endure psychological suffering, that it involves confronting one's own darkness and integrating what one would prefer to deny. The years from 1913 to 1919 constituted Jung's own heroic descent, his night sea journey, his traversal of the underworld. He emerged fundamentally changed, no longer the ambitious young clinician seeking recognition within the psychoanalytic movement, but a mature explorer of the psyche who had touched the archetypes directly and lived to tell the tale. The rest of his career would be devoted to articulating what he had learned during this period, translating the visionary material of the Red Book into the concepts and language of analytical psychology, providing maps and methods so that others could undertake similar journeys with greater safety and clarity. He never again experienced visions with the overwhelming intensity of those years, but he never forgot what they had taught him, and they remained the bedrock upon which his entire theoretical edifice was built. By 1919, the worst of Jung's confrontation with the unconscious had passed. He had not been destroyed by the forces he encountered, had not disappeared into psychosis, had not lost his capacity to function in the ordinary world. Instead, he had gained experiential knowledge of the psyche's depths, had mapped territories that few had explored so systematically, had developed techniques for working with unconscious material that went beyond Freudian dream interpretation. He began the long process of translating his visionary experiences into psychological concepts, writing papers and books that would lay the theoretical foundations of analytical psychology as distinct from Freudian psychoanalysis. His marriage to Emma survived, though not without strain. Emma Jung was a remarkable woman in her own right, highly intelligent, interested in psychology, eventually an analyst herself with her own patients and students. She tolerated Carl's affairs with other women, his emotional volatility, his absorption in his inner work, his long silences and retreats to Bollingen. But she also demanded recognition, space for her own development, Carl's acknowledgement that she was not merely an appendage to his life, but a person with her own needs and trajectory. The marriage became a psychological arrangement rather than a romantic union, a container within which both parties could pursue individuation while maintaining the forms of bourgeois respectability and providing stability for their children. The most significant of Jung's extramarital relationships during and after the Red Book period was with Tony Wolff, a former patient who became his collaborator, lover, and intellectual companion. Wolff was brilliant, intuitive, unstable, deeply connected to the archetypal realm, able to follow Jung into territories that Emma found either uninteresting or threatening. She served as Jung's anima figure, the inner feminine that mediated between his conscious ego and the unconscious, embodying the relational eros that complemented his logos-oriented consciousness. The relationship was known to Emma, who eventually accepted it as a psychological necessity, a triangulation that allowed Carl to maintain both his connection to ordinary life through marriage and his connection to the unconscious through his relationship with Tony. This arrangement, which would have been scandalous had it been more public, reflected Jung's conviction that conventional morality must sometimes yield to psychological necessity, that the demands of individuation might require violations of social norms, that one's primary loyalty was to the self rather than to collective expectations. He distinguished between ethics, the living examination of how one should act in specific circumstances based on genuine moral consciousness, and morality, the dead letter of social convention that no longer carries authentic ethical force. This distinction allowed him to rationalize his affairs, his deceptions, his emotional manipulations, by framing them as serving a higher purpose. Critics have rightly pointed out the self-serving nature of this reasoning, the way it privileged Jung's own desires and justified real harm to Emma and others. Defenders note that Jung never claimed to be a moral exemplar, that he acknowledged his shadow fully, and that his emphasis on integrating the dark side of personality included accepting one's own ethical failures rather than projecting them onto others. Professionally, Jung rebuilt his practice, attracting patients from around the world who sought analysis with the man who had penetrated the unconscious so deeply. His patients during this period included people from many countries, backgrounds and professions, artists and writers, scientists and theologians, wealthy individuals with resources to spend months or years in Zurich, engaging in intensive analysis. Many reported transformative experiences, profound healings, encounters with aspects of themselves they had never known existed. Others found the work confusing, overwhelming, insufficiently structured, too dependent on Jung's charismatic personality and his own unique visionary experiences to be reliably replicated with other analysts. Jung began teaching, offering seminars in his home in Küsnacht, attracting a circle of students and followers who would carry analytical psychology into the next generation. These seminars covered dreams, alchemy, Nietzsche's Zarathustra, children's dreams, various aspects of Jung's emerging theory. They were informal affairs, more conversations than lectures, with Jung speaking extemporaneously, exploring ideas aloud, encouraging students to contribute their own observations and questions. Many of these seminars were transcribed and eventually published, providing rich material that supplemented Jung's formal writings with more spontaneous and personal reflections. He travelled extensively, seeking to understand how archetypes manifested in cultures radically different from European Christianity. In 1925, he visited the Pueblo Indians in New Mexico, conversing with a chief named Ochwiai Biano, Mountain Lake, about the differences between Native American and white consciousness. Mountain Lake told Jung that white people were crazy, always thinking, living in their heads rather than in their hearts or bellies, disconnected from the earth and from the sacred. He said that the Pueblo people knew they were sons of the sun, that their ritual dances helped the sun rise each day, that they lived in harmony with the cosmos rather than trying to dominate it through thinking and technology. Jung was struck by this alternate mode of consciousness, this sense of participation mystique with nature, this embedding of the individual within the cosmic order. In 1926, Jung travelled to East Africa, to Kenya and Uganda, observing tribal peoples and wildlife, experiencing landscapes and ways of life utterly foreign to European modernity. He watched vast herds of animals moving across the savannah, felt himself transported back in time to an earlier stage of human evolution, recognized in the African environment something that corresponded to layers of his own unconscious, to the primitive psyche that underlay civilized consciousness. He had a dream in Africa in which he descended through layers of a house, from modern rooms at the top, down through medieval levels, to ancient Roman foundations, to prehistoric caves where a skull lay, representing successive strata of consciousness and unconsciousness. The dream became for Jung a parable of the psyche's structure, conscious mind resting on personal, unconscious resting on collective unconscious, resting on biological instincts, each layer containing and building upon the one below. In 1938, Jung travelled to India at the invitation of the British government to participate in celebrations marking the 25th anniversary of the University of Calcutta. He spent several months on the subcontinent, visiting temples and ashrams, meeting with scholars of Hindu and Buddhist philosophy, observing religious practices and states of consciousness that challenged Western assumptions about the nature of reality and selfhood. He was fascinated and disturbed by what he encountered, drawn to the East's sophisticated technologies of consciousness, its maps of meditation states and spiritual development, its recognition that the ego was not the center of personality, but a limited and ephemeral phenomenon. Yet he also felt that Indian spirituality, particularly its emphasis on transcending the ego and dissolving into the absolute, represented a path inappropriate for Western individuals who had not yet sufficiently developed ego consciousness. Jung argued that the East had historically privileged the unconscious over consciousness, dissolution over differentiation, that its spiritual practices aimed at extinguishing the individual in favour of merger with the cosmic whole. The West, by contrast, had privileged consciousness, individuality, the development of ego as separate from nature and collectivity. Each had its wisdom and its pathology. The task for modern Western individuals was not to simply adopt Eastern practices, but to find a third way, one that honoured both consciousness and unconsciousness, both individuality and connection to the larger whole, both ego and self. Individuation was this third way, a process that required developing a strong ego before relativizing it, differentiating oneself from the collective before re-establishing connection at a deeper level, becoming conscious of the unconscious without being overwhelmed by it. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, Jung published the works that established the core concepts of analytical psychology. Psychological Types appeared in 1921, presenting his theory of introversion and extroversion and the four functions of consciousness: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. The book argued that individuals have different innate preferences for how they direct libido, either primarily outward toward the external world or inward toward the internal world, and for how they perceive reality and make judgments. These typological differences were not pathological, but reflected the natural diversity of human consciousness. Understanding one's type helped explain why certain approaches to life came easily, while others required great effort, why one resonated with particular philosophies or spiritual traditions, why conflict often arose between people of opposite types. Jung published essays on the structure of the psyche, distinguishing the persona or social mask from the shadow or personal unconscious, introducing the anima and animus as the contrasexual archetypes, describing the self as the archetype of wholeness. He wrote on the collective unconscious and archetypes, arguing that beneath the personal unconscious lay a deeper stratum common to all humans, containing universal patterns that structured human experience and manifested in mythology, religion, fairy tales, and individual dreams and visions. He explored synchronicity, the phenomenon of meaningful coincidence, proposing that psyche and matter were not absolutely separate, but connected at a deep level through a causal ordering principle that transcended linear causality. He engaged extensively with alchemy, recognizing in medieval alchemical texts not merely failed chemistry, but symbolic descriptions of psychological transformation. The alchemist's quest to transmute lead into gold was a projection of the individuation process, the transformation of base unconscious material into the gold of consciousness, the integration of shadow into light, the creation of the lapis philosophorum, or philosopher's stone that represented the realized self. Jung spent decades studying alchemical manuscripts, correlating alchemical symbols with dream motifs and active imagination material, demonstrating that his patients' spontaneous imagery often paralleled alchemical sequences despite having no conscious knowledge of alchemy. This provided empirical evidence that the unconscious produced genuinely archetypal content, images and patterns that were not learned but innate. He wrote on religion, particularly Christianity, treating religious doctrines and symbols as expressions of archetypal realities rather than as metaphysical truths or mere superstitions. The Trinity, the virgin birth, the crucifixion and resurrection, the Mass, all reflected deep structures of the psyche, ways the collective unconscious represented psychological processes of death and rebirth, union and separation, transformation and integration. Jung's approach was psychological rather than theological. He claimed no knowledge of whether God existed metaphysically, but insisted that the God image existed psychologically as one of the most powerful and universal archetypes, that religious experience was a legitimate and important psychological phenomenon, and that the dismissal of religion as illusion impoverished the psyche and left individuals without access to the symbols and rituals that facilitated wholeness. His work was controversial from the beginning and remains so. Academic psychologists found it too mystical, too willing to blur boundaries between empirical observation and speculative philosophy, too accepting of paranormal phenomena and occult interests. Theologians and clergy found it reductionistic in a different way from Freud, treating religious truths as mere psychological projections, relativizing divine revelation to the status of archetypal image, dissolving theological certainties into shifting symbolic meanings. Feminists critiqued his essentialism about gender, his tendency to treat masculinity and femininity as fixed archetypal opposites rather than culturally constructed categories, his heteronormative assumptions embedded in the anima animus framework. Social critics noted his political conservatism, his distrust of social reform, his tendency to privilege individual psychological work over collective action. Most damningly, Jung's statements and silences during the Nazi period raised questions about his character and judgment that have never been fully resolved. In the early 1930s, as Hitler rose to power, Jung made comments distinguishing between Jewish psychology and Aryan psychology, suggesting that Jews had a different collective unconscious from Germanic peoples, that Freud's theories reflected Jewish psychology's emphasis on sexuality and the personal unconscious, while Jung's reflected Aryan psychology's connection to the collective, unconscious and archetypal depths. He accepted a leadership position in a German psychological society that had expelled its Jewish members. He published in German journals, edited journals that became propaganda organs, wrote articles that at minimum showed appalling insensitivity to what was happening, and at worst expressed sympathy with aspects of Nazi ideology about the awakening of Germanic archetypes. Jung's defenders argue that he was naive rather than anti-Semitic, that he believed psychology should investigate differences between groups without prejudice, that he privately helped Jewish analysts emigrate and maintained friendships with Jews, that his organizational involvement was motivated by a desire to keep international psychology alive rather than support for Nazism. Critics respond that intellectual naivete is not an adequate excuse, that his comments gave scientific cover to racist ideology at a moment of supreme danger, that his actions benefited him professionally during a period when ethical clarity required sacrifice, and that his later explanations minimized his responsibility. The truth likely includes both elements. Jung was not a Nazi sympathizer in any straightforward sense, but he was egocentric, ambitious, insufficiently horrified by what was happening, and willing to rationalize ethically dubious choices as serving the larger cause of psychology and individuation. The controversy matters not only because it raises questions about Jung's character, but because it touches on a central tension in his psychology. If individuation is the supreme value, if psychological integrity takes precedence over social convention, if the self transcends collective morality, then what prevents this from becoming a license for ethical solipsism, for justifying any action that serves one's own psychological development? Jung never adequately answered this question. He insisted that genuine individuation led to greater responsibility and ethical sensitivity, that integrating the shadow made one less likely to project evil onto others, that the individuated person became more rather than less capable of love and justice. But he also exempted himself from the moral scrutiny he applied to others, treating his own questionable actions as somehow serving a higher purpose. The contradiction remains unresolved, a shadow in Jung's own legacy that his followers must continue to grapple with. By the outbreak of World War II, Jung had established analytical psychology as an alternative to Freudian psychoanalysis, and Adlerian individual psychology, had attracted students and patients from around the world, had published major works that would shape 20th century thought in psychology, religious studies, anthropology, and the humanities. He had survived his own confrontation with the unconscious, had emerged with a mature psychology grounded in that experience, and had entered the second half of life with a clarity about his own path and purpose. The next decades would be devoted to deepening and extending his insights, to training the next generation of analysts, to engaging with thinkers from other disciplines, and to synthesize in his lifetime of work into the major texts that would constitute his legacy. The foundations were in place. The work of building upon them could now proceed. To understand Jung's vision of the psyche, one must first abandon the assumption that consciousness is equivalent to the totality of the mind, that what we know of ourselves is all there is to know, that the ego that says I is the master of its own house. Jung recognized that consciousness is merely the surface of a vast interior ocean, a thin membrane separating the known from the unknown, the illuminated from the dark. The psyche extends far beyond the narrow circle of ego awareness, encompassing personal history we have forgotten or repressed, collective patterns we have inherited but never consciously learned, and organizing principles that transcend individual existence altogether. The task of psychology, as Jung conceived it, was to map this larger territory, to understand how the different parts relate to each other, and to facilitate the ongoing dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious that he saw as essential to psychological health and development. At the center of conscious awareness sits the ego, the complex of images, memories, perceptions, and thoughts that constitutes our sense of I, our continuity of personal identity across time, our capacity to will, choose, and act as a unified subject. The ego is not given at birth, but develops gradually during childhood as the infant differentiates itself from the mother and the surrounding world, as language acquisition allows for the organization of experience into narrative form, as socialization demands increasing conformity to collective expectations and the suppression of instinctual impulses. A healthy ego possesses sufficient strength to maintain coherent identity, to pursue goals, to delay gratification, to adapt to external reality, and to mediate between the demands of inner drives and outer circumstances. A weak ego collapses under stress, fragments into dissociated parts, loses the capacity for reality testing, or becomes overwhelmed by unconscious contents that erupt into consciousness as symptoms, compulsions, or hallucinations. The ego is not the whole of consciousness, but rather its center, the subjective experiencer to which conscious contents are referred. Surrounding the ego is the personal consciousness, the field of awareness that contains perceptions, thoughts, and feelings accessible to the ego at any given moment. This field has a threshold, a level of intensity that psychic contents must reach to become conscious. Below this threshold lies the personal unconscious, a reservoir of memories, experiences, and mental contents that were once conscious but have faded from awareness, either because they lack current relevance or because they have been actively repressed due to their incompatibility with the ego's self-image and values. Everything we have experienced, learned, thought, and felt remains somewhere in the psyche, potentially recoverable under the right conditions, though much of it will never return to consciousness because it was never particularly important or has been superseded by later experience. The persona is the mask we wear in our transactions with the world, the social role or set of roles through which we present ourselves to others and through which we participate in collective life. The word persona comes from the Latin for the masks worn by actors in classical theatre, masks that not only concealed the actor's face, but also served to amplify the voice so it could be heard throughout the amphitheatre. The persona is similarly both a concealment and a means of effective communication, a necessary adaptation to social reality that allows us to function in various contexts without revealing everything about ourselves or burdening every interaction with the full complexity of our inner life. We develop different personas for different contexts: the professional persona we present at work, the familial persona we inhabit with relatives, the friendly persona we show to acquaintances, the intimate persona we reveal to lovers and close friends. A well-developed persona is flexible, appropriate to circumstances, and does not entirely conceal the individuality of the person wearing it. Problems arise when the persona becomes identified with the ego, when we mistake the role for the reality, when we believe that we are nothing more than doctor or teacher or parent or whatever function we fulfill in the collective sphere. Such identification leads to a kind of psychological emptiness, a sense of being hollow, of going through the motions without genuine feeling or engagement. The person who has become identical with their persona lacks access to their own depths, has sacrificed authenticity for acceptance, has allowed the social role to consume the individual personality. Alternatively, some individuals fail to develop an adequate persona at all, remaining so identified with subjective impulses and moods that they cannot function effectively in collective life, offending others through inappropriate behavior, failing to fulfill social obligations, unable to adapt to the expectations that make communal existence possible. Behind or beneath the persona lies the shadow, that part of the personality which has been relegated to the unconscious because it contradicts the ego ideal, because it threatens the persona we wish to present, because it contains characteristics we judge to be inferior, shameful, or unacceptable. The shadow is personal in content, consisting of traits and impulses specific to the individual's biography and psychology, yet it manifests as a universal phenomenon because all human beings must repress or suppress aspects of themselves to function in society and maintain a consistent self-image. We all have a shadow, and the more narrowly we define ourselves, the more we insist on being only good or only reasonable or only loving, the larger and darker our shadow grows. The shadow contains not only moral failings and destructive impulses, but also positive qualities that we have failed to develop, potentials that remain unrealized because they did not fit the life path we chose or the identity we constructed. An individual who has emphasized intellectual achievement may have shadowed their emotional life, their capacity for playfulness, their need for physical expression. Someone who has devoted themselves to caring for others may have shadowed their ambition, assertiveness, and capacity for healthy selfishness. The shadow is thus not purely negative, but represents the unlived life, the road not taken, the aspects of personality that were sacrificed to ego development and persona construction, but that retain their vitality in the unconscious, waiting for recognition and integration. We typically encounter our shadow first through projection, attributing to others the qualities we refuse to recognize in ourselves, reacting with disproportionate emotion to faults in others that mirror our own unacknowledged characteristics. The person who loudly condemns dishonesty in others while engaging in subtle deceptions, the ascetic who obsesses over others' sexual behavior, the nice person who is outraged by any display of anger or aggression, all reveal through their intense reactions the presence of unintegrated shadow material. What we judge most harshly in others points directly to what we have most successfully hidden from ourselves, and the emotional heat of our judgment signals the psychic energy invested in maintaining the repression. Jung considered shadow work, the process of recognizing and integrating shadow contents, to be the first essential task of individuation. One cannot become whole by denying half of oneself, by insisting on being only light while projecting all darkness outward. Integration requires acknowledging that we are capable of the very things we condemn, that we contain cruelty as well as kindness, selfishness as well as generosity, cowardice as well as courage. This recognition is humiliating for the ego, which prefers to maintain its illusions of moral superiority, but it is also liberating, reducing the energy expended on repression and projection, increasing psychological flexibility, and making genuine relationship possible because we can see others as they are rather than as screens for our disowned contents. The shadow appears in dreams as a figure of the same sex as the dreamer, often threatening, pursuing, or confronting the ego figure. The dream shadow may be a criminal, a beggar, a sexual deviant, a fool, anyone who represents qualities the ego rejects. Sometimes the shadow appears as a fascinating and powerful figure, embodying vitality and authenticity that the conscious personality lacks. Working with shadow dreams involves asking what qualities the shadow figure possesses, recognizing those qualities as aspects of oneself that have been disowned, and finding ways to consciously integrate them without being overwhelmed by them. This is delicate work, requiring honesty, humility, and the willingness to admit that one is not who one thought one was, that the carefully constructed self-image is partial and defensive, that wholeness demands embracing the despised and rejected parts of oneself. Integration does not mean acting out shadow impulses, giving free rein to destructive tendencies, or abandoning ethical standards. It means acknowledging that one contains these impulses, observing them without identification, understanding their origins and compensatory function, and finding constructive expressions for the energy they carry. The person who integrates aggressive shadow contents may become more assertive, more capable of healthy confrontation, better able to establish boundaries without becoming cruel or violent. The person who integrates dishonest shadow contents may become more realistic about human nature, less naive, more capable of strategic thinking without becoming a liar or manipulator. The goal is not to eliminate the shadow, but to bring it into consciousness where its energy can be channeled and its insights can inform rather than undermine ego functioning. Shadow work also extends to the collective level, recognizing that groups, nations, and cultures have collective shadows, aspects of their own nature that they deny and project onto other groups. The history of warfare, persecution, and genocide reveals the catastrophic consequences of collective shadow projection, when an entire people attributes all evil to an external enemy and fails to recognize its own capacity for cruelty, its own participation in the very atrocities it condemns. Jung witnessed this process in the Nazi demonization of Jews, in the Allied demonization of Germans, in the mutual projections of the Cold War. He argued that lasting peace would require collective shadow work, each nation and culture confronting its own darkness rather than locating all evil in the other, acknowledging complicity in violence rather than claiming moral purity. The structure of the psyche that Jung mapped, ego at the center of consciousness, persona as the outer adaptation, shadow as the personal unconscious contents that have been rejected or unrealized, provides the foundation for understanding psychological functioning and dysfunction. Neurosis often involves identification with the persona, excessive inflation or weakness of the ego, and failure to integrate shadow contents that then erupt as symptoms, compulsions, or projections. Health involves a flexible ego capable of adapting without losing itself, a persona that facilitates social functioning without consuming individual identity, and ongoing integration of shadow material so that unlived aspects of personality can enrich rather than undermine conscious life. This is not a static achievement, but a dynamic process, because new life circumstances constantly create new demands, uncovering previously hidden shadow contents and requiring new adaptations of persona and ego. Jung's model was inherently dynamic and dialectical, emphasizing the interplay between opposites, the compensation of consciousness by unconsciousness, the self-regulating nature of the psyche that seeks balance and wholeness even when ego consciousness resists. The psyche does not merely react to external stimuli, but actively generates content, produces dreams and symptoms, and creative expressions that seek to correct one-sided conscious attitudes, that push toward integration, that serve the deeper telos or purpose of individuation. Understanding this structure and its dynamics was essential preparation for the deeper work of encountering the collective unconscious, the archetypes, and the self, which lay beyond the personal shadow in territories that transcended individual biography and connected the person to the timeless patterns of human experience. Jung's early work on the word association test led him to one of his most important discoveries, that the personal unconscious is not a chaotic jumble of repressed memories and forgotten experiences, but is organized into complexes, emotionally toned clusters of associated images, ideas, memories, and feelings that function as semi-autonomous splinter psyches within the larger personality. A complex has its own continuity, energy, and tendency, exerting influence on consciousness from below the threshold of awareness, shaping perceptions, triggering emotional reactions, and occasionally taking control of behavior in ways that the ego experiences as alien or involuntary. Everyone has complexes because everyone has had experiences that aroused strong affect, particularly in childhood when the ego was weak and vulnerable, and those emotionally charged experiences became nodes around which associated material clustered, creating psychological structures that persist across time. A mother complex begins with the individual's actual experience of the personal mother, all the interactions, frustrations, satisfactions, fears and longings that characterized that primal relationship. But it does not consist only of those personal memories. The complex extends backward to include fantasies about the mother, the idealized mother or terrifying mother that may bear little relation to the actual woman, and forward to include expectations and templates that shape future relationships, particularly romantic partnerships where the mother imago is unconsciously projected onto the partner. The complex also extends downward to touch the archetypal level, connecting to the Great Mother archetype, the universal human pattern of the maternal that transcends any individual mother and carries primordial images of nourishment and devouring, birth and death, the womb as creative source and tomb. When a complex is activated by an external stimulus that resonates with its core emotional tone, it momentarily takes over consciousness, producing reactions disproportionate to the triggering event. A woman with a negative mother complex may respond to a colleague's mild criticism with the overwhelming emotions appropriate to a child being rejected by its mother, experiencing rage or despair that makes no sense to observers who see only the objective situation. A man with a strong father complex may react to authority figures with excessive submission or rebellion, never relating to them as they actually are, but only as manifestations of the internalized father who continues to dominate his psyche. In extreme cases, the complex can create a temporary dissociation, a moment when the person is not themselves. When a complex-driven part of the personality has pushed the ego aside and seized control of speech and action. The word association test revealed complexes through disturbances in response time, unusual associations, emotional reactions, and memory lapses. If a stimulus word activated a complex, the smooth flow of neutral associations was interrupted, the reaction time increased. The chosen response word bore the mark of the complex's emotional tone, and in subsequent trials the subject often could not remember what word they had originally given, as if a kind of amnesia surrounded the complex-touched material. Jung realized that these disturbances provided empirical evidence for the unconscious, that they demonstrated the existence of psychological contents operating outside of conscious awareness and exerting measurable influence on behavior. Freud's concept of repression pointed to similar phenomena, but Jung's formulation emphasized structure and organization rather than merely the fact of content being pushed out of consciousness. The complex is not inherently pathological. A well-integrated complex enriches personality, provides emotional depth, connects the individual to significant life experiences and relationships. The father complex carried by someone who had a positive relationship with a loving and principled father can be a source of inner strength, a connection to values and integrity, an internalized guide that supports mature decision-making. The problem arises when a complex remains unconscious and unintegrated, when it operates autonomously, when the ego is too weak or rigid to assimilate the complex or too identified with it to achieve any distance. Neurotic symptoms often represent the complex breaking through, demanding recognition, expressing in disguised form what consciousness refuses to acknowledge. Projection is one of the primary ways complexes manifest in relationships. We project when we perceive in another person qualities that actually belong to our own psyche, when we react to the other, not as they are, but as a stand-in for an internal figure. The intensity of the reaction signals the presence of projection. If someone irritates us mildly, we may simply be responding to their actual characteristics. If they enrage us disproportionately, if we cannot stop thinking about them, if their mere existence seems to threaten our well-being, then we are almost certainly projecting a complex. The other person has become a hook upon which we hang our own unconscious contents, and we are relating not to them but to the complex we have projected. Romantic love often begins as mutual projection of the anima or animus, archetypes we will explore in a later chapter, but even before that level, partners project personal complexes onto each other. The man seeks a woman who will fulfill his need for maternal nourishment or affirm his sense of masculine adequacy, projecting his mother complex or his need for ego validation. The woman seeks a man who embodies the father's strength and protection or offers the unconditional acceptance she never received in childhood, projecting her father complex or her need to be seen and valued. In the early stages of relationship, these projections create fascination, the sense that the other person is uniquely important, the feeling of having found one's missing half. As the relationship matures, the projections inevitably fail because the real person cannot sustain them, and the partners face the choice of withdrawing projection and seeing each other more realistically, or clinging to the projections and blaming the partner for failing to live up to the fantasy. Withdrawing projection is painful and difficult, requiring one to acknowledge that the qualities one perceived in the other belong to oneself, that the longed-for mother or father or saviour or muse is not out there but must be found or developed within. It also requires seeing the actual person who has been obscured by projection, recognising their limitations and humanity, giving up the inflation and specialness that projection confers. Many relationships end at this point because neither party is willing to undertake the work of relating to a real human being rather than a projection screen. But those who succeed in withdrawing projections find that a deeper and more genuine relationship becomes possible, one based on actual knowledge of the other rather than fantasy, on mutual support for individuation rather than merger or mutual exploitation. Complexes are not static but evolve over time as new experiences add layers of association and as psychological work brings unconscious contents into consciousness. Therapy in the Jungian tradition often focuses on complex work, identifying which complexes are most active and problematic, tracing their origins in personal history, recognizing how they are being projected in current relationships, and facilitating their integration through insight, emotional release, symbolic expression, and changes in behavior. Dreams regularly feature complex material, presenting images that represent the complex and dramatizing the relationship between the ego and the complex. A dream in which one is pursued by a threatening figure may represent a negative mother or father complex that the ego experiences as persecutory. A dream in which one encounters a fascinating but dangerous stranger may represent a complex that carries both creative potential and the risk of possession. Active imagination can also be used to engage directly with complexes, allowing the complex to personify as an inner figure with whom one can dialogue. Jung learned this technique during his Red Book period when he conversed with Philemon, Elijah, Salome, and other inner figures who represented different aspects and levels of his own psyche. A person working with a strong negative mother complex might enter into active imagination and allow the internalized mother figure to appear, then engage her in conversation, ask what she wants, listen to her complaints and demands, and gradually discover what psychological content the complex carries and what function it serves. This can be intense and disturbing work because the complex will often express the emotional reality of early trauma, the rage or grief, or terror that the child experienced but could not process, and confronting that material requires considerable ego strength and often the support of a skilled therapist. Complexes also connect to the archetypal layer of the psyche, and this is where Jung's model diverges most significantly from Freud's. For Freud, all psychological content ultimately derives from personal experience, particularly childhood experience, mediated through the fundamental structures of ID, ego, and superego. For Jung, personal complexes have an archetypal core, touching universal patterns that transcend individual history. The mother complex is personal in its content, the specific memories and affects associated with one's actual mother, but it is archetypal in its structure, organized around the Great Mother archetype that exists a priori as a potential form of human experience. This explains why the mother complex carries mythological resonances, why it connects to fairy tale themes of the good mother and wicked stepmother, why it can be activated by cultural symbols and religious images of the Madonna or Kali, why it seems to have a numinous quality that exceeds what one's personal mother could have imparted. Understanding complexes as structures with both personal and archetypal dimensions allowed Jung to explain phenomena that puzzled him in his clinical work, cases where patients had intense emotional reactions or persistent symptom patterns that seemed disproportionate to their actual childhood experiences, as if the complex were drawing on a deeper source of psychic energy than personal memory alone could provide. He saw that complexes could be constellated not only by personal triggers, but also by collective situations, that a cultural crisis or archetypal motif appearing in art or myth could activate personal complexes because the two levels interpenetrated. This insight became crucial for understanding collective psychology, the way entire populations could fall under the spell of an archetype, could become possessed by complexes operating at the cultural level, could act out in history the same dramas that individuals enacted in their private neuroses. The personal unconscious, organized into complexes with both personal and archetypal dimensions, thus stood as the middle layer between ego consciousness and the deeper collective unconscious. It was the realm of individual biography and personal relationships, yet it was not hermetically sealed from the transpersonal depths, but rather served as the interface where archetypal patterns took on individual colouring and where individual experience connected to collective themes. Working through one's complexes was not merely therapeutic in the sense of symptom relief, but was itself a step toward individuation, because it required differentiating from unconscious identifications, withdrawing projections, integrating disowned material, and establishing a conscious relationship to forces that had previously operated autonomously. The more one could make the complexes conscious, the less power they had to disrupt ego functioning, and the more their energy became available for creative living, rather than being bound up in symptoms, compulsions, and repetitive relational patterns. Jung's most original and controversial contribution to psychology was his concept of the collective unconscious, a level of the psyche deeper and more universal than the personal unconscious, containing not the forgotten or repressed contents of an individual's life history, but the inherited psychological potentials shared by all members of the human species. Where the personal unconscious is unique to each individual, shaped by biography and circumstance, the collective unconscious is essentially identical in all people, a common substratum that transcends culture, geography, and historical period, manifesting in similar forms across humanity's diverse expressions of art, religion, mythology, and dream. Jung arrived at this concept through several converging lines of evidence. First, his clinical observation that patients spontaneously produced images and symbols in their dreams and active imaginations that paralleled mythological motifs from cultures they had never studied and could not have known about through ordinary learning. A Swiss housewife with no education in comparative religion might dream of being devoured and reborn by a whale, replicating the night sea journey of Jonah and countless hero myths. A European intellectual might produce in active imagination mandalas identical in structure to Tibetan sand paintings, despite having no exposure to Tibetan Buddhism. These parallels could not be explained by cultural transmission or personal experience, but suggested an inborn capacity to generate certain types of images and patterns. Second, his comparative study of mythologies, fairy tales, and religious systems revealed striking similarities in basic motifs despite the absence of historical contact between cultures. The flood myth appears in Mesopotamian, Hebrew, Greek, Hindu, Native American, and countless other traditions. The dying and resurrected god, virgin birth, divine child, world tree, paradise and fall, hero's journey, descent to the underworld, all repeat with variations that preserve essential structural elements. These universals could be explained either by diffusion, the spread of myths through cultural contact, or by polygenesis, the independent generation of similar myths in different cultures. Jung opted for polygenesis, arguing that the human psyche was so structured that it naturally produced these patterns, that myths were not merely cultural artifacts, but expressions of psychic realities, symbolic representations of unconscious processes. Third, his study of child development and children's dreams showed that archetypal images appeared even in very young children who had minimal cultural conditioning. A 4-year-old girl might dream of a threatening father figure with godlike attributes, of cosmic battles between good and evil, of journeys to magical realms, drawing on imagery that exceeded anything in her limited life experience. Jung concluded that these images did not originate from external sources, but welled up from a deep layer of the psyche that was activated by developmental transitions and emotional crises, a layer that carried forward the psychological heritage of the species. Jung termed the formal elements of the collective unconscious archetypes, from the Greek archetypos, meaning original pattern or model. He was drawing on Plato's theory of forms, the transcendent templates that precede and structure particular manifestations, and on Kant's categories of understanding, the a priori structures that organize sensory experience into coherent perception. Archetypes are not inherited ideas or images, but rather inherited potentials for experiencing and representing certain fundamental situations of human life. They are forms without content, structures that become filled with specific material depending on culture, personal experience, and circumstances, but that shape that material according to innate patterns. The archetype itself, which Jung sometimes called the archetype as such, or psychoid archetype, is irrepresentable, unknowable directly, existing as a pure potential in the deepest layers of the unconscious where psyche and biological instinct interpenetrate. What we encounter are archetypal images, the specific manifestations of archetypes in dreams, visions, myths, religious symbols, and artistic productions. The Great Mother archetype manifests as the Virgin Mary, Demeter, Kali, Isis, the fairy godmother, the wicked stepmother, one's own mother, and countless other images, all variations on the fundamental pattern of the maternal, as source of life, nourishment, protection, and also as devouring, possessive, preventing growth and separation. The archetype organizes these diverse images into a recognizable category, and individuals encountering any manifestation of the archetype feel the emotional power and numinosity that signals contact with something transpersonal. Archetypes carry tremendous psychic energy, what the historian of religion Rudolf Otto called the numinous, the sense of encountering something wholly other, fascinating and terrifying, that evokes awe, dread, reverence, and the feeling of being in the presence of a power greater than oneself. When an archetype is activated or constellated in the psyche, ordinary consciousness is overwhelmed, the ego feels small and powerless, emotions surge with an intensity that exceeds what the immediate situation warrants. This is why religious experience has such power, why falling in love feels like possession by a god, why the birth of a child carries mythic resonance, why approaching death evokes archetypal imagery of journeys and transitions. In these threshold moments of human existence, the archetypes are activated, and the personal situation becomes transparent to the universal pattern underlying it. Jung identified numerous archetypes structuring human experience. The self is the archetype of wholeness and the center of the total psyche, encompassing both consciousness and unconsciousness, the organizing principle toward which development aims. The shadow, which we discussed earlier at the personal level, also has a collective dimension, the universal human capacity for evil, destruction, and regression. The persona, too, has archetypal structure, manifesting in the various social roles and masks humans across cultures adopt to function in collective life. The anima and animus, which we will explore in detail in a subsequent chapter, represent the contrasexual aspects of personality, the inner feminine in men and inner masculine in women, serving as psychopomps or guides between consciousness and the unconscious. The hero is an archetype representing ego consciousness, separating from unconsciousness, the journey toward independence, the battle with regressive forces that would pull consciousness back into infantile dependence or dissolution. The hero slays dragons, rescues maidens, descends to underworlds and returns with treasure, all symbolic expressions of the ego's struggle to establish itself against the overwhelming power of the unconscious while also learning to cooperate with unconscious forces rather than merely oppose them. The wise old man and wise old woman archetypes represent accumulated knowledge and guidance, the inner voice of wisdom that speaks when the ego has exhausted its own resources, appearing in myths as Merlin, the oracle, the hermit, the guru, the sage. The trickster is an archetype of disruption and transformation, appearing as Coyote, Hermes, Loki, the fool, the figure who breaks rules, upends expectations, introduces chaos into order, and through this disruption creates space for change and renewal. The trickster reveals the shadow of the gods and of consciousness itself, showing that no system is complete, that what seems most certain contains its own contradiction, that play and humour and irreverence serve necessary psychological functions. The divine child is the archetype of new beginnings, vulnerability and promise, the innocent one who carries hope for renewal and transformation, appearing in myths as the infant hidden from enemies, the orphan who becomes king, the child prophet or saviour. Archetypes of transformation include the death-rebirth motif, found in initiation rites, religious mysteries, shamanic dismemberment and reconstitution, the crucifixion and resurrection, all representing the necessity of psychological death as prelude to new life, the dying of an outworn identity to make way for a more comprehensive personality. The coniunctio or sacred marriage represents the union of opposites, masculine and feminine, consciousness and unconsciousness, spirit and matter, producing a third thing that transcends the original polarities, symbolized in alchemy as the philosopher's stone, in mythology as the divine child born from the union of god and goddess, in individual psychology as the integrated personality that includes both ego and self. Jung emphasized that archetypes are not platonic forms existing in some metaphysical realm independent of human experience, but are rather rooted in the structure of the brain and nervous system, the product of evolutionary pressures that shaped human psychology over millions of years. Repeated typical situations, infancy and helplessness, parents and their care or neglect, sexuality and reproduction, danger and safety, death and grief, all structured the developing human brain so that it contained inherited patterns for responding to these situations. These patterns then found expression through the symbols available in each culture, but the underlying structure remained constant, which is why modern dreams contain the same archetypal motifs as ancient myths. The relationship between archetypes and instincts is complex. Jung proposed that archetypes and instincts were two sides of the same phenomenon, instincts representing the biological impulse toward action, archetypes representing the psychological form of that impulse, the image or pattern that accompanies instinctual behavior. The maternal instinct in humans and animals is paralleled by the Great Mother archetype. The drive to nurture the young finding psychological expression in images of Madonna and child, the milk-giving goddess, the protective presence. Sexual instinct is paralleled by archetypes of the divine syzygy, the paired masculine and feminine, the lover as god or goddess, the sexual act as sacred hieros gamos. Aggression and territoriality find expression in warrior gods, battle myths, images of conquest and domination. Critics of Jung's theory of archetypes have raised numerous objections. Some argue that he was merely discovering cultural universals produced by diffusion, that myths spread through trade and conquest, and that their similarities prove nothing about inherent psychic structures. Jung countered with cases where no plausible route of transmission existed, where patients with no access to obscure mythological material produced images uncannily similar to those myths, where children's dreams contained elaborate archetypal scenarios that exceeded their cultural exposure. Other critics suggest that Jung conflated biological innateness with cultural construction, that he took historically contingent gender roles and power structures and elevated them to the status of eternal archetypes, thus naturalizing and justifying hierarchies that were in fact produced by specific social conditions. This critique has particular force regarding Jung's treatment of gender, where his formulations of anima and animus, his descriptions of masculine and feminine archetypal qualities, often reflect the gender norms of early 20th century European culture, rather than universal truths about men and women. Jung tended toward essentialism, treating masculinity and femininity as fixed archetypal opposites rather than as fluid and culturally variable, and this limits the applicability of his model to contemporary understandings of gender as spectrum rather than binary, of gender identity as complex and multifaceted rather than determined by biological sex. Despite these legitimate criticisms, the concept of the collective unconscious and archetypes remains powerful and productive, explaining phenomena that other psychological theories struggle to address, the universal themes in human storytelling, the spontaneous production of religious and mystical symbols, the uncanny feeling of recognition when encountering myths and images from cultures far removed from one's own, the way certain images and patterns carry emotional resonance that exceeds their immediate content. Whether one accepts Jung's specific formulations or seeks to revise and extend them, the core insight remains valid, that human beings share a common psychological heritage, that the psyche is structured in ways that transcend individual experience, and that attending to the archetypal dimension enriches both therapeutic practice and cultural understanding. The collective unconscious, populated by archetypes that manifest through symbols, myths, and dreams, is not a realm separate from ordinary life, but the deep background against which personal existence unfolds, the mythic dimension that gives individual experience its ultimate meaning and connection to the species-wide human story. We live simultaneously on two levels, as particular individuals with unique biographies navigating specific historical and social circumstances, and as instantiations of eternal patterns, enacting once again the timeless dramas of birth and death, love and loss, quest and transformation that have structured human existence since consciousness first emerged from the animal background. Jung's psychology invites us to recognize both levels, to honor both the personal and the archetypal, and to understand that individuation involves becoming conscious of how the universal patterns are lived through our particular lives. Archetypes are not abstract theoretical constructs accessible only to specialists, but living realities manifested in the stories humans tell, the gods they worship, the rituals they perform, and the art they create. To understand archetypes concretely, one must turn to mythology, religion, fairy tales, and cultural productions, where archetypal patterns appear in endlessly varied forms while preserving recognizable core structures. Jung devoted much of his career to comparative study of these materials, demonstrating that his patients' dreams and visions repeated motifs found in cultures worldwide, establishing that the collective unconscious was empirically observable through its symbolic expressions. Consider the hero myth, which appears in some form in virtually every culture's mythology and continues to structure contemporary narratives in film, literature, and popular culture. The hero's journey, as synthesized by Joseph Campbell, based largely on Jung's insights, begins with the call to adventure, a disruption of ordinary life that summons the protagonist to leave the familiar world. The hero initially refuses the call, clinging to safety and convention, but eventually accepts, often with the help of a supernatural aid or mentor figure, crossing the threshold from the known world into the realm of adventure, darkness, or the supernatural. In this unknown territory, the hero faces trials and challenges, encounters enemies and allies, descends into the belly of the whale or underworld, confronts the ultimate challenge, death itself or the most terrible adversary, and achieves victory through courage, cunning, sacrifice, or transformation. The hero returns to the ordinary world, often reluctantly, bearing a boon or elixir or wisdom gained from the journey, and must integrate the lessons of the adventure into everyday life. This pattern appears in the stories of Gilgamesh, Moses, Buddha, Jesus, Odysseus, Aeneas, countless fairy tale protagonists, and modern fictional heroes from Luke Skywalker to Harry Potter to Katniss Everdeen. Psychologically, the hero's journey represents the ego's separation from the unconscious, the process by which consciousness differentiates itself from the original state of participation mystique with the mother and the collective, develops its own identity and agency, confronts the regressive pull of the unconscious that would dissolve hard-won identity back into infantile dependency, and finally achieves a mature relationship to the unconscious characterized by dialogue rather than either fusion or rigid opposition. The hero's initial refusal reflects ego's natural resistance to change and fear of the unknown. The supernatural aid represents archetypal support from the self, which sends dreams, intuitions, synchronicities to guide the hero forward. The descent into darkness is the encounter with the shadow and with death, the recognition that consciousness alone is insufficient and that new resources must be found in the depths. The virgin birth, appearing in Christianity, Buddhism, Greek mythology, and numerous other traditions, represents the archetypal theme of the divine child, the new consciousness, or renewed spiritual life that emerges not through ordinary biological means, but through intervention of the transcendent. Psychologically, it symbolizes the birth of the self, the emergence of wholeness from sources beyond ego control, the spontaneous upwelling of new potential that cannot be willed into existence, but can only be received as grace. The virginity emphasizes purity of origin, unmixed with the merely personal or historical, pointing to something genuinely new rather than merely recombined from existing materials. The great goddess appears across cultures in myriad forms, always embodying the archetypal feminine in its multiple aspects. As Demeter, she is the nourishing mother, the grain giver, source of sustenance, bereft when her daughter Persephone is abducted to the underworld, threatening to withhold fertility unless the child is returned. As Kali, she is the terrible mother, wearing a necklace of skulls, destroying as well as creating, representing the destructive aspect of time and nature that devours what it has brought forth. As Isis, she is the magician and resurrector, gathering the scattered fragments of Osiris and restoring him to life, demonstrating the feminine power to heal and make whole. As the Virgin Mary, she is the pure vessel, the mediatrix between human and divine, the compassionate mother who intercedes for suffering humanity. These diverse images all express aspects of the archetypal feminine as Jung conceived it, the great mother who is source and goal, womb and tomb, the one who gives life and takes it back, who nourishes and devours, who facilitates growth through letting go or prevents growth through possessive holding. The positive mother complex provides security, nourishment, the foundation for trust and healthy development. The negative mother complex threatens to engulf and prevent separation, keeping the child eternally dependent, devouring emerging independence, manifesting in the psychology of individuals as fear of life, inability to commit, regressive longings, and in mythology as the witch who imprisons, the dragon who guards the treasure and prevents access to it, the seductress who lures heroes to their doom. The wise old man archetype appears as Zeus, Odin, the Jewish god in his aspect as lawgiver and judge, Merlin, Gandalf, the sage or guru who possesses esoteric knowledge and serves as guide to those undertaking spiritual journeys. Psychologically, this archetype represents the archetype of meaning, the aspect of the self that provides interpretation and understanding, that speaks through intuition and sudden insight, that connects present experience to larger patterns and purpose. When the wise old man appears in dreams, often as a teacher, doctor, priest, king, or magical figure, he offers guidance at moments when the ego's conscious resources prove insufficient, pointing towards solutions that exceed the dreamer's conscious understanding, representing accumulated wisdom not only of the individual but of the collective. The shadow of God appears in figures like Satan, Loki, Set, the trickster deities who disrupt divine order, and in the problem of evil that monotheistic religions struggle to explain if God is both omnipotent and omnibenevolent. Jung's controversial book, Answer to Job, argued that the biblical God displays a shadow, engaging in cruelty toward Job that cannot be justified by theological rationalizations about testing faith or mysterious divine purposes. The Book of Job, in Jung's reading, reveals that Yahweh is unconscious, acting out destructive impulses without moral reflection, and that Job's suffering forces consciousness upon God, leading eventually to the incarnation of Christ as God's attempt to experience human suffering and thereby achieve moral consciousness. This interpretation treats biblical narratives as psychological documents revealing archetypal processes rather than historical accounts of divine action, a move that religious believers often find reductive but that Jung saw as honoring the psychological truth of Scripture while bracketing questions of metaphysical truth. Alchemy provided Jung with an extraordinarily rich source of archetypal symbolism. Medieval alchemists sought to transmute base metals into gold, to discover the elixir of immortality, to create the lapis philosophorum, or philosopher's stone that would cure all disease and perfect all substances. Their laboratory work was accompanied by elaborate symbolic texts, illustrated manuscripts depicting symbolic sequences, dragons and lions, kings and queens in sacred marriage, dissolution in water and heating in fire, death and putrefaction followed by whitening and final reddening, stages called nigredo, albedo, and rubedo. Jung recognized that these texts were not merely failed chemistry, but projections of the individuation process, symbolic descriptions of psychological transformation. The alchemists were working on matter but were unconsciously enacting psychological processes, projecting the transformation of consciousness onto chemical operations, seeing in the behavior of substances the drama of the psyche moving from fragmentation toward wholeness. The base metal was the unredeemed personality, caught in unconsciousness and a neurosis. The gold was the realized self, consciousness integrated with unconsciousness, the perfected personality. The various operations of dissolving, separating, heating, combining all corresponded to psychological processes, the dissolution of rigid structures, the separation of elements that had been confused, the application of emotional heat to break down defenses, the final integration of opposites in the conjunctio or sacred marriage. Jung spent years studying alchemical texts, learning Latin and medieval symbolism, acquiring a library of rare manuscripts, comparing alchemical sequences with his patients' dreams and active imaginations. He found astonishing parallels, his patients spontaneously producing images of dissolution in water, of snakes and dragons, of royal couples, of circular mandalas symbolizing wholeness despite having no conscious knowledge of alchemy. This provided powerful evidence that the unconscious was structured by archetypal patterns, that it naturally produced certain types of symbols in certain sequences during the process of psychological transformation, and that these symbols appeared across cultures and historical periods because they reflected deep structures of the human psyche. Fairy tales, too, revealed archetypal patterns. The wicked stepmother and absent or weak father in countless fairy tales represent the negative parent complexes that the child must overcome. The youngest son or third brother who succeeds where his older siblings failed represents the undervalued aspect of personality, the ego function that seems least likely to succeed, but that carries the potential for renewal because it has not been overdeveloped and rigidified. The helpful animals who aid the hero when he shows them kindness represent instinctual wisdom, the guidance that comes from attending to nature and body rather than relying solely on conscious planning. The treasure guarded by a dragon represents the self, the priceless value hidden in the unconscious, guarded by the terror of confronting what one most fears. Religious rituals enact archetypal patterns communally, providing structured containers for threshold experiences. Baptism represents death and rebirth, immersion in water as return to the womb, emergence as a new being, cleansed and renewed. The Mass reenacts the sacrifice of the god, consumption of sacred food and drink that effects participation in divine nature, transformation of substance that mirrors the psychological transformation of the worshipper. Initiation rites in tribal cultures enact the hero's journey, the youth torn from mother, subjected to ordeals and trials, symbolically killed and resurrected as an adult member of the community, incorporating the tribal mysteries and archetypal wisdom that consciousness alone cannot grasp. Jung saw modern civilization as impoverished by the loss of meaningful rituals and symbols, the collapse of religious frameworks that had provided archetypal containers for psychological processes. When collective religion loses its vitality, when rituals become empty forms, when symbols are interpreted only literally or dismissed as superstition, individuals are left without access to the archetypal dimension, without ways to sacralize threshold moments of birth, marriage, death, without communal support for individuation. The result is a society of isolated egos, cut off from depths, vulnerable to possession by primitive archetypal forces that erupt as mass movements, fanaticism, addiction, desperate searches for meaning in consumerism or ideology. Jung hoped that awareness of the archetypes could help modern individuals create new symbolic forms, personal rituals, individual paths to the numinous that did not require adherence to dogmatic religion, but that honored the psychological needs that religion had historically addressed. He encouraged active imagination, dream work, engagement with myth and art, building of temenos, spaces like his Bollingen Tower, all as ways of accessing the archetypal dimension and facilitating individuation in a secular age. He also recognized the danger that without traditional containers, individuals might be overwhelmed by archetypal material, might mistake ego for self, might succumb to inflation or dissolution. The task was to find a middle path, neither rejecting the archetypes in rationalistic denial nor being passively overwhelmed by them, but entering into conscious relationship with them as realities that transcended and relativized ego consciousness while remaining accessible through symbolic engagement. The study of archetypes in myth, religion, and culture reveals that Jung's psychology is not narrowly therapeutic, concerned only with alleviating symptoms, but is a depth psychology in the fullest sense, concerned with the meaning of human existence, the relationship between individual and collective, the possibility of transformation and wholeness, the sacred dimension that manifests through psychological processes. For Jung, therapy was not simply adjustment to social norms or resolution of childhood conflicts, but facilitation of the individual's unique relationship to the archetypes, support for the individuation process that connected personal life to the timeless patterns that give human existence its ultimate significance. In recognizing the archetypal dimension, one recognized one's participation in the great human story, one's reenactment of dramas older than any individual life, one's connection to sources of meaning and energy that transcend the personal and the temporal. We have touched on the shadow in discussing the structure of the psyche, but this archetype of darkness, of the rejected and despised in ourselves and in the collective, demands deeper exploration, because shadow work forms the essential first phase of individuation, because failure to integrate the shadow leads to destructive projection and unconscious acting out, and because the collective shadow, the darkness that groups deny in themselves and attribute to others, has produced the catastrophes of genocide, persecution, and warfare that scar human history. The shadow is not merely a philosophical concept, but a living reality, encountered first in one's repulsion toward others who display qualities one has disowned, later in the shattering recognition that one is capable of the very cruelty, cowardice, or corruption one has most loudly condemned. At the personal level, the shadow contains everything about oneself that contradicts the ego ideal, the image of who one wishes to be and to be seen as. For the person who prides themselves on rationality, the shadow holds emotionality, irrationality, the primitive and the chaotic. For the person who identifies with compassion and niceness, the shadow contains aggression, selfishness, the capacity to wound and manipulate. For the person who values self-control and discipline, the shadow harbors laziness, hedonism, the desire to abandon responsibility and regress into infantile gratification. The stronger the conscious identification with virtue, the darker the shadow grows, because psychological energy denied its natural expression does not disappear, but accumulates in the unconscious, waiting for moments of reduced vigilance to erupt as symptom, slip of tongue, compulsion, or sudden inexplicable behavior that the ego later disavows. Shadow work begins with recognition, the painful acknowledgement that one contains the qualities one despises in others, that the finger pointing outward points simultaneously inward, that the emotional intensity of one's judgments betrays the presence of unintegrated shadow material. This recognition typically arrives through humiliation, the collapse of cherished self-images, the revelation of one's own hypocrisy or failure. The person who has preached sexual purity finds themselves in an affair. The person who has condemned dishonesty discovers they have been lying to themselves. The person who has presented a facade of strength breaks down and reveals vulnerability. These moments are psychologically crucial because they shatter ego inflation, force the recognition of complexity and limitation, and create the possibility of greater wholeness through integrating what was previously denied. Dreams assist in shadow recognition by presenting the dreamer with shadow figures, characters of the same sex as the dreamer who embody rejected qualities. The shadow often appears as a threatening or repulsive figure, a criminal, beggar, person of despised social status, someone embodying qualities the ego considers inferior or shameful. Sometimes the shadow appears as a powerful and fascinating figure, a rebel, outlaw, sexual adventurer, someone who lives more fully and freely than the ego dares. In either case, the dream shadow carries qualities that the ego has rejected, but that the total personality requires for wholeness. Working with shadow dreams involves asking what qualities the shadow figure possesses, recognizing those qualities in oneself and finding constructive ways to integrate them. Projection is the primary mechanism by which shadow contents are encountered in external life. We project the shadow onto others who resemble it sufficiently to serve as hooks for the projection, then react to them with disproportionate emotion, fascination or repulsion, unable to see them as they actually are because we are relating to our own disowned contents. The person or group that becomes the target of projection is never entirely arbitrary. They usually do display some trait that connects to the projected material, but the intensity and irrationality of the response betrays that something more than objective perception is occurring. In relationships, shadow projection creates chronic conflict and misunderstanding. Partners project onto each other the negative aspects they refuse to acknowledge in themselves, then blame the other for the very faults they themselves possess. The cycle of mutual projection can trap couples in repetitive arguments where each defends themselves against accusations that actually describe the other person's disowned shadow, leaving both feeling misunderstood and attacked. Withdrawing shadow projections requires taking responsibility for one's own darkness, recognizing that the qualities one perceives in the partner are first and foremost one's own, and learning to distinguish between projection and accurate perception of the other's real limitations. Integration of the shadow does not mean acting out shadow impulses or abandoning ethical standards, a common misunderstanding of Jungian psychology that treats shadow work as license for selfish or destructive behavior. Integration means acknowledging that one contains these impulses, observing them without identification, understanding their origins and functions, and finding appropriate expressions for the energy they carry. The integrated aggressive impulse becomes assertiveness, the capacity to set boundaries, to compete healthily, to fight for what matters. The integrated selfish impulse becomes self-care, the recognition that one cannot serve others from a depleted well, that attending to one's own needs is not mere narcissism, but a prerequisite for genuine generosity. Jung distinguished between the personal shadow, unique to each individual's biography and choices, and the collective shadow, the universal human capacity for evil, destruction, and regression that every society struggles to contain and that periodically erupts in episodes of mass violence and moral collapse. The collective shadow includes not only the darkness that all humans share, but also the specific shadow of particular cultures, nations, or groups. The unacknowledged guilt, the historical crimes, the ongoing injustices that are denied or rationalized rather than confronted and amended. Nazi Germany provided Jung with a horrifying laboratory for studying the collective shadow in action. An entire nation, whose culture had produced Goethe, Beethoven, Kant, and countless other luminaries of Western civilization, descended into barbarism, embracing a genocidal ideology that projected all evil onto Jews and other scapegoated groups while claiming Aryan racial purity and superiority. Jung understood this as a massive eruption of the collective shadow, the dark side of the Germanic psyche that had been repressed under Christianity and Enlightenment rationalism. The myth of Wotan, the ancient Germanic god of fury, ecstasy, and possession, had been constellated, taking possession of millions of individuals who lost their ethical bearings and participated in or tolerated atrocities that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. Jung's analysis of Nazi Germany as a possession by archetypal forces was both insightful and problematic. It explained aspects of the phenomenon that purely sociological or economic analyses struggled to address: the quasi-religious fervour, the symbols and rituals, the sense of participating in a cosmic drama, the willingness of ordinary people to commit extraordinary evil. But it also risked minimizing individual and collective responsibility by attributing evil to impersonal archetypal forces beyond human control, as if Germans were helpless victims of possession rather than moral agents who made choices, however conditioned by circumstance and propaganda those choices were. Jung walked a line between psychological explanation and moral judgment, insisting that understanding did not mean excusing, that recognizing archetypal dynamics did not absolve individuals of responsibility for their actions. The collective shadow also manifests in the projection of evil onto enemy nations, ethnic groups, or ideologies, the process by which in-groups purify their self-image by attributing all darkness to out-groups. This dynamic has driven countless wars, persecutions, and genocides throughout history, from the Crusades to colonialism to ethnic cleansing to contemporary terrorism and counter-terrorism. Each side sees itself as righteous and the other as evil incarnate, failing to recognize that the very qualities condemned in the enemy exist also in the self, that the capacity for cruelty, fanaticism, and dehumanization knows no ethnic or national boundaries, that evil is a human potential rather than the special property of particular others. Jung argued that lasting peace would require collective shadow work at the societal level, each nation confronting its own historical crimes and ongoing injustices rather than locating all evil externally. This would mean Germans facing not only Nazi atrocities, but the cultural and psychological conditions that made those atrocities possible, acknowledging collective guilt rather than claiming to be victims of Hitler and a small group of fanatics. It would mean Americans confronting slavery, genocide of indigenous peoples, imperialism, and ongoing structural racism rather than maintaining mythologies of innocence and exceptional virtue. It would mean every nation engaging in honest self-examination, acknowledging complicity in suffering, and making genuine amends rather than merely performing symbolic gestures. Such collective shadow work is extraordinarily difficult because nations, like individuals, resist acknowledging their darkness, fear the loss of identity, and esteem that comes with confronting uncomfortable truths, and find it psychologically easier to project shadow onto others than to integrate it. Yet without this work, the cycles of violence continue, each generation repeating the projections and conflicts of previous generations, unable to break free because the fundamental dynamic of shadow projection remains unaddressed. Jung was not optimistic about humanity's capacity for collective shadow integration, particularly in the second half of the 20th century, when nuclear weapons gave the collective shadow the power to literally destroy civilization. But he insisted that the attempt had to be made, that individual shadow work was a contribution to collective healing, that enough individuals achieving consciousness could gradually shift the collective. The ethical implications of shadow integration are complex. Jung maintained that recognizing one's capacity for evil made one less likely to enact it, that consciousness was the antidote to possession, that integrating the shadow increased moral sensitivity rather than undermining it. The person who has acknowledged their own cruelty is less likely to be unwittingly cruel, more capable of catching themselves before acting out destructive impulses, more empathic toward others' suffering because they recognize similar potential in themselves. The person who has faced their own cowardice is less likely to self-righteously condemn others who fail to be heroic, more realistic about human limitations, more compassionate toward moral failure. Critics respond that this assumes a level of self-knowledge and self-control that most people do not possess, that merely recognizing one's capacity for evil does not necessarily prevent one from committing evil, that in fact such recognition could be used to rationalize wrongdoing by treating it as inevitable or natural. The Jungian response is that unconsciousness of the shadow is far more dangerous than consciousness, that individuals and groups who believe themselves incapable of evil are precisely those most likely to commit it while remaining convinced of their righteousness, that the monsters of history have typically been people who identified completely with the light and projected all darkness onto their victims. Shadow work is never complete because new life circumstances constantly reveal previously hidden shadow contents, because the ego naturally constructs new idealizations that create new shadows, because the collective shadow continues to evolve and constellate in new forms. But the initial encounter with the personal shadow, the shattering recognition that one is not who one thought, that darkness lives within as well as without, that the enemy is also oneself, constitutes the essential first step in individuation, without which the remaining work cannot proceed. For only when one has faced one's own darkness can one genuinely encounter others as they are rather than as projection screens. Only then can one approach the contrasexual archetypes of anima and animus without being overwhelmed by their numinous power. Only then can one begin the journey toward the self without mistaking ego inflation for genuine wholeness. The shadow is the gateway to the unconscious, and refusing to pass through that gate means remaining trapped in the narrow circle of ego consciousness, defended against the depths that alone can provide genuine transformation. Beyond the personal shadow lies another layer of the unconscious that mediates between ego consciousness and the deeper collective strata, the archetypes Jung named anima and animus, the contrasexual elements of personality, the inner feminine in men and the inner masculine in women. These figures serve as psychopomps or guides, leading consciousness toward encounter with the unconscious, appearing in dreams as fascinating and numinous presences, projected in outer life onto romantic partners with an intensity that overwhelms rational judgment, carrying both the promise of wholeness and the danger of possession by forces the ego cannot comprehend or control. Jung arrived at the concept of anima through his own inner work during the Red Book period, when he encountered feminine figures in his visions who seemed to possess knowledge and perspective independent of his conscious mind. These figures spoke to him, challenged him, seduced him toward dissolution, guided him toward integration, embodying qualities of eros, relatedness, receptivity, and connection to the unconscious that his logos-oriented consciousness lacked. He recognized that these were not external beings, but personifications of aspects of his own psyche, yet they possessed such autonomous reality that relating to them required the same seriousness one would bring to relationships with actual persons. They were, he concluded, manifestations of the anima, the archetype of the feminine within the masculine psyche. For Jung, biological sex determined which contrasexual archetype was primarily active in the unconscious. Men, whose conscious identity was typically masculine, carried an unconscious feminine figure, the anima. Women, whose conscious identity was typically feminine, carried an unconscious masculine figure, the animus. This formulation reflected Jung's essentialist assumptions about gender, his conviction that masculinity and femininity represented archetypal opposites rooted in biological and psychological differences rather than culturally constructed categories. He associated masculinity with logos, rationality, discrimination, activity, consciousness, and femininity with eros, relatedness, receptivity, passivity, unconsciousness. These associations have rightly been critiqued as reflecting the gender stereotypes of early 20th century European culture rather than universal truths, yet the core insight that the psyche contains contrasexual elements remains valuable even if Jung's specific formulations require revision. The anima in men develops through 4 stages, each representing increasing differentiation and integration of the feminine. At the most primitive level, the anima appears as purely biological, the sexual instinct and bodily desire personified in the figure of the seductress or prostitute, the woman as object of lust without individual personality or spiritual dimension. At the second level, she appears as the romantic beloved, the idealized woman who inspires devotion and creativity, still largely a projection, but now carrying aesthetic and emotional values, manifesting in the troubadour tradition, courtly love, the muse who inspires the poet or artist. At the third level, she appears as the spiritual guide, the Virgin Mary or Sophia or Beatrice, wisdom personified as feminine, leading the man toward higher consciousness and ethical refinement. At the fourth level, she appears as Sapientia or wisdom itself, no longer projected onto external women, but recognized as an inner reality, the feminine aspect of the self that completes and balances masculine consciousness. Most men, Jung observed, remain fixated at the first or second levels, relating to women primarily as sexual objects or idealized projections rather than as autonomous persons, never developing a conscious relationship to the inner feminine that would free them from compulsive projection and allow genuine encounter with actual women. The work of anima integration involves withdrawing projections, recognizing that the qualities one seeks in women belong first to one's own psyche, developing the capacity for relatedness, feeling, imagination, and connection to the unconscious that the anima embodies. A man who has integrated his anima becomes more whole, more capable of intimacy, more in touch with his own depths, less tyrannized by sexual compulsions and romantic idealizations that prevent real relationship. The anima appears in dreams as a female figure, often beautiful and fascinating, sometimes helpful and sometimes dangerous, representing the dreamer's current relationship to the unconscious feminine. She may appear as a young girl, a maternal figure, an old woman, a witch, a goddess, each manifestation revealing a different aspect or level of the archetype. When the anima is positive, she facilitates creativity, provides intuition and insight, connects the man to his emotional life and to the symbolic dimension of experience. When she is negative, she generates moods, depressions, irrational emotionality, possession by effects that overwhelm ego functioning, leading to sulking, passive aggression, and withdrawal from active engagement with life. Jung's personal experience with anima projections shaped his understanding profoundly. His relationships with Sabina Spielrein, Toni Wolff, and other women involved intense projections of anima qualities, the lover as muse and psychopomp, facilitating his access to the unconscious, but also creating complications, betrayals, and suffering for all involved. He struggled throughout his life to differentiate between the actual women in his life and the anima projections he placed upon them, never fully succeeding in this differentiation, but gaining through the struggle a deep appreciation for how powerful and compelling anima projection could be, how it could convince a man that a particular woman was uniquely necessary for his wholeness, how withdrawal of the projection felt like loss of the beloved, when in fact it was only the return of a psychological content to its proper location within. The animus in women, as Jung described it, functioned differently from the anima in men, manifesting less as a single figure than as a plurality of masculine voices or opinions, what Jung sometimes called the animus as committee or tribunal. Where the anima in men tended toward moodiness and affect, the animus in women tended toward opinionatedness and conviction, the woman possessed by animus expressing herself in rigid judgments, categorical pronouncements, argumentation for its own sake, identification with abstract principles divorced from human relatedness and emotional reality. The negative animus manifested as the voice that told a woman she was worthless, that she should not trust her own perceptions, that she was too emotional or irrational, the internalized patriarchal voice that undermined feminine authority and authenticity. Jung proposed that the animus developed through stages parallel to those of the anima, though his descriptions of these stages were less detailed and convincing, reflecting both his own limitations as a man attempting to understand women's psychology and the cultural context in which women's inner masculine development was constrained by external patriarchal structures. At the first level, the animus appeared as physical power and strength, the man as protector or aggressor. At the second level, he appeared as the man of action, initiative, enterprise. At the third level, he appeared as the professor or clergyman, bearer of the word and knowledge. At the fourth level, he became the spiritual guide, Hermes or wise teacher, facilitating the woman's connection to meaning and higher consciousness. The work of animus integration for women involved differentiating from collective opinions and borrowed convictions, developing authentic thinking and judgment rooted in one's own experience, learning to express assertiveness and authority without being possessed by rigid dogmatism, and recognizing the animus as an inner resource rather than projecting it onto men who were then expected to provide meaning, purpose, and connection to the larger world. A woman who had integrated her animus, in Jung's view, became more capable of independent thought, more able to act decisively in the world, more balance between feminine relatedness and masculine discrimination and focus. Contemporary critiques of Jung's anima and animus theory are substantial and necessary. His heteronormative assumptions, his equation of biological sex with psychological gender, his essentialist attributions of qualities to masculine and feminine, his tendency to describe the feminine in terms of lack or opposition to the masculine rather than in its own positive terms, all reflect limitations that make his specific formulations problematic for contemporary gender understanding. His framework assumes binary gender, leaves no space for transgender experience or gender fluidity, treats heterosexuality as normative, and often valorizes traditionally masculine qualities while treating feminine qualities as valuable primarily insofar as they complement and complete the masculine. Post-Jungian theorists have worked to revise and extend Jung's insights while discarding his problematic essentialism. Some have proposed understanding anima and animus not as fixed contrasexual opposites, but as dynamic archetypal potentials available to all individuals regardless of biological sex, symbolic representations of psychological qualities that every person must develop and integrate. Others have explored how same-sex relationships and non-binary gender identities complicate and enrich the anima-animus framework, requiring new models that honor the diversity of human gender expression and sexual orientation while preserving the insight that the psyche contains multiplicities, that consciousness is not all there is, and that integration requires encounter with otherness within. Despite these necessary critiques and revisions, the core insight remains valuable, that every individual contains qualities and potentials associated with the other, that development toward wholeness requires integrating these contrasexual elements rather than projecting them exclusively onto external others, and that the figures of anima and animus serve as guides between consciousness and the unconscious, mediating between the ego and the self. The specific content of what counts as masculine or feminine may be more culturally variable and individually diverse than Jung recognized, but the structural insight that the psyche seeks completion through encounter with its own otherness, that fascination and projection point toward disowned aspects of oneself, and that individuation involves integrating, rather than eliminating these contrasexual dimensions, retains explanatory and therapeutic power. Projection of anima or animus onto actual persons creates the phenomenon of falling in love, the overwhelming conviction that a particular individual is uniquely suited to complete one's being, that union with this person will bring wholeness and fulfillment, that life without them is intolerable. The beloved becomes luminous, invested with qualities that may or may not correspond to their actual characteristics, seen through a golden haze that obscures their human limitations and elevates them to divine or archetypal status. This state, while often generating great poetry and passionate devotion, is also a form of possession, the ego overwhelmed by archetypal energies it cannot control, relating not to the actual person, but to an inner figure that has been projected onto them. All relationships that last must eventually pass through the withdrawal of anima and animus projections, the painful recognition that the beloved is not the god or goddess one imagined, that they have flaws and limitations, that they cannot fulfill the archetypal promise the projection offered. Many relationships end at this point, the partners unable to sustain connection once the numinous quality fades, disappointed that the person no longer seems so special or transformative. But those who remain together through this crisis have the opportunity to develop genuine relationship based on seeing and accepting the actual person rather than the projection, and to undertake the work of integrating the anima or animus within rather than seeking it exclusively without. Jung himself never fully achieved this integration, his marriage to Emma remaining dutiful but not passionate, his affairs with other women continuing to carry anima projections that he could not or would not withdraw, his relationship to the feminine remaining complicated and ambivalent to the end of his life. This personal failure to fully realize what he taught does not invalidate the teaching, but does serve as a reminder that psychological knowledge and psychological achievement are different matters, that understanding does not automatically produce transformation, and that even the most insightful individuals remain works in progress, struggling with the same complexes and projections they analyze in others. The anima and animus, mediating between ego and self, between consciousness and the deeper unconscious, serve as essential guides on the path of individuation, leading consciousness toward encounter with archetypal realities that transcend personal history and individual identity. To integrate these contrasexual elements is to become more complete, more capable of relating both to others and to one's own depths, more balance between the qualities and potentials traditionally assigned to masculine and feminine. This integration does not dissolve the mystery of the other, does not eliminate projection entirely, does not result in a static achievement of wholeness, but it does increase consciousness, flexibility, and the capacity for genuine encounter with both the external and internal worlds. The journey continues beyond anima and animus to the ultimate archetype, the self, which encompasses and transcends all partial identifications and offers the goal toward which individuation aims. At the center and circumference of Jung's psychology stands the self, the archetype of wholeness, the organizing principle of the total personality, the goal toward which the individuation process aims, and paradoxically, also the source from which that process emerges. The self is not the ego, not the conscious I that thinks and chooses and identifies with particular traits and roles, but the larger personality that encompasses both consciousness and unconsciousness, ego and shadow, persona and anima or animus, personal history and collective archetypal dimensions, the totality of what one is and can become. The self is both the center that organizes psychic life and the circumference that includes everything the ego excludes. The answer to the question, who am I in the fullest sense, not the partial answer offered by ego consciousness, but the complete answer that includes all one has been, is, and might become. Jung's conception of the self emerged from his Red Book experiences, particularly his encounters with Philemon and other autonomous inner figures who seemed to possess wisdom and perspective exceeding anything Jung's conscious ego could generate. These figures spoke with authority, offered insights that surprised and sometimes contradicted Jung's conscious intentions, demonstrated that the psyche contained an organizing intelligence that transcended ego and operated according to its own purposes and patterns. Jung gradually recognized that these figures were manifestations of the self, personifications of the archetype of totality, representatives of the deeper center that coordinated psychic life and guided development toward wholeness. The self manifests symbolically through certain recurring images and motifs that appear across cultures and throughout history, images of wholeness, completeness, perfect symmetry, and eternal order. The mandala, the circular or square image with a center, appears in Hindu and Buddhist religious art, in the rose windows of Gothic cathedrals, in the ground plans of temples and sacred cities, in the spontaneous drawings of Jung's patients who knew nothing of Eastern symbolism. The mandala represents the self, the ordering principle that structures chaos into cosmos, the center that holds everything in relationship, the image of perfection toward which the psyche moves. Jung noticed that his patients produced mandala images during times of psychological crisis and transition, as if the unconscious were generating symbols of wholeness precisely when the conscious personality felt most fragmented and threatened with dissolution. Other symbols of the self include the divine child, representing new beginnings and the future potential of the personality, the wise old man or woman, embodying accumulated wisdom and guidance, the hermaphrodite or androgyne, representing the union of masculine and feminine opposites, the sacred quaternity or fourfold structure, appearing in the four Gospels or four directions or four seasons, the lapis philosophorum or philosopher's stone of alchemy, representing the perfected personality, Christ as the God-man who unites divine and human natures, the Buddha in his state of enlightenment, transcending the polarities of existence. All these images point toward wholeness, toward the reconciliation of opposites, toward a state of being that includes and transcends the conflicts and partialities that characterize ordinary consciousness. The relationship between ego and self is complex and paradoxical. The ego is necessary, the center of consciousness, the subjective agent, without which there is no experience of being a distinct individual. Without ego, there is only the original state of unconscious fusion, the participation mystique of infancy and archaic consciousness, the dissolution of the individual into the collective or the unconscious. Development requires the emergence of ego, the differentiation of a center that can say, I, that can reflect on experience, that can make choices and pursue goals. But ego alone is insufficient, too narrow, too identified with only a portion of the total personality, too prone to inflation when it mistakes itself for the whole, too vulnerable to possession by complexes and archetypes it does not recognize or understand. Individuation involves the ego coming to recognize the self as the true center and totality, relinquishing the pretense of being the master of the house, accepting its subordinate position within the larger psyche while retaining its necessary function as the conscious experiencer and executor. This is a humbling process, requiring the ego to acknowledge its limits, to surrender its inflation, to accept that it is not the creator of consciousness, but rather a product of unconscious processes it did not initiate and cannot fully control. Yet this surrender is not a dissolution of ego, but a right relationship between ego and self, the smaller serving the larger, consciousness cooperating with the unconscious, rather than either dominating it or being overwhelmed by it. Jung distinguished carefully between the ego and the self to avoid the confusion that arises when people mistake self-actualization or ego development for realization of the self. The self is not achieved through willpower, through accumulating accomplishments, through perfecting the ego's capacities. The ego cannot create the self because the self is already present as the organizing principle of the psyche, the hidden wholeness that has been operating from birth, guiding development, compensating one-sidedness, producing dreams and symptoms that seek to correct imbalance. The task is not to create wholeness, but to realize it, to become conscious of what has always been there, to allow the self to manifest more fully in consciousness, while recognizing that it extends far beyond what consciousness can encompass. The self expresses itself through the processes Jung called compensation and the transcendent function. Compensation refers to the psyche's tendency to balance one-sided conscious attitudes through unconscious contents that provide the missing perspective. If consciousness becomes too rational, too identified with thinking and planning, the unconscious produces emotional eruptions, irrational impulses, dreams of chaotic or watery imagery that force attention to the neglected feeling function. If consciousness becomes too passive, too identified with waiting and receiving, the unconscious produces aggressive or assertive imagery, dreams of battles and conquests that push toward greater activity and engagement. The psyche self-regulates, seeking equilibrium, resisting the ego's tendency toward one-sidedness and extremity. The transcendent function describes the process by which consciousness and unconsciousness engage in dialogue to produce a new perspective or solution that transcends the original conflict. When the ego faces an apparently irresolvable dilemma, caught between equally unsatisfactory alternatives, unable to move forward through rational deliberation, the self may intervene through dreams, active imagination, or sudden intuition, offering a third possibility that was not visible from the ego's limited vantage point. This new perspective comes from the self, the larger intelligence that sees what ego consciousness cannot see, that has access to the collective wisdom of the unconscious, that operates teleologically toward wholeness rather than being trapped in the causal determinism of past conditioning. Jung's concept of the self has been compared to the Atman of Hindu philosophy, the innermost essence identical with Brahman or ultimate reality, and to the Buddha nature of Buddhism, the inherent potential for awakening present in all beings. He saw parallels between his psychological discoveries and the insights of Eastern religious traditions, recognizing that what he was discovering empirically, they had mapped symbolically and experientially through centuries of meditation and spiritual practice. The self as Jung conceived it was not metaphysical, not a soul that survived bodily death, or a divine essence literally identical with God, but a psychological reality, the archetype of meaning and totality, the God within understood as psychological function rather than theological entity. This psychological approach to religious categories troubled both religious believers who felt he was reducing divine reality to mere psychic projection, and secular rationalists who felt he was smuggling mysticism into science. Jung maintained that he was simply describing what he observed empirically, that the self appeared in human experience as the most powerful and comprehensive archetype, that it functioned psychologically as traditional religions claimed God functioned, and that whether anything existed beyond this psychological reality was a metaphysical question he could not and need not answer. He insisted on the distinction between the God image, the way divinity appeared to and functioned for the human psyche, and God in itself, the ontological question of whether anything corresponded to that image independent of human experience. The encounter with the self can be overwhelming, producing what Jung called inflation, the ego's identification with archetypal contents that vastly exceed its capacity. When the self constellates powerfully, as in mystical experiences, profound dreams, or moments of creative inspiration, the ego may mistake itself for the source of these experiences, believing that it has achieved godhood, that it possesses special powers or knowledge, that ordinary human limitations no longer apply. This inflation is dangerous, leading to grandiosity, loss of reality testing, inability to maintain relationships and responsibilities, potential for paranoid or messianic delusions. History and psychiatric wards contain many examples of individuals who confused ego with self and suffered the catastrophe that follows such identification. The antidote to inflation is humility, the recognition that the numinous experiences and powerful insights that seem to come from oneself actually come through oneself from a source beyond ego control, that one is the recipient and vessel for these contents rather than their creator, that one must remain grounded in ordinary human reality, even while acknowledging the extraordinary nature of what one has encountered. Jung's own near-psychotic episodes during the Red Book period taught him the necessity of maintaining ego boundaries even while opening to the unconscious, of not identifying with Philemon or other archetypal figures, of remembering that he was Carl Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist with a family and professional obligations, not a prophet or messiah or god. Dreams of the self often involve images of perfection, wholeness, powerful figures of authority or wisdom, numinous encounters with divine or cosmic realities. The dreamer may meet a king or queen, a guru or saint, may witness extraordinary natural phenomena, may experience flying or other transcendent states, may see geometric patterns or mandalas, may encounter animals representing the union of opposites like the dragon or phoenix. These dreams carry special emotional weight, what Jung called the numinous quality, the sense of having contacted something ultimate and sacred, and they often occur at crucial transitions in life when the personality is reorganizing itself around a new center or moving toward greater integration. The realization of the self, the goal of individuation, does not mean ego dissolution or mystical merger with the absolute as some Eastern paths propose, nor does it mean ego perfection or the achievement of complete consciousness. It means establishing a living relationship between ego and self, consciousness cooperating with the unconscious, the smaller serving the larger, while retaining its distinctness and function. The individuated person remains fully human, continues to have limitations and failures, still struggles with complexes and shadows, but operates from a different center, guided by the self rather than merely by ego desires and social conditioning, attentive to dreams and synchronicities and the symbolic dimension of experience, oriented toward meaning and wholeness rather than merely towards success and pleasure. Jung recognized that describing the self was inherently difficult because it encompassed everything, included the observer and the observed, transcended the categories of subject and object that structure ordinary thought. Language could point toward the self through symbols and paradoxes, but could not capture it directly, which is why religious traditions resorted to negative theology, describing God through what God is not, or to poetry and mythological narrative that evoked rather than explained. His own writing about the self mixed clinical observation, philosophical speculation, mythological amplification, and personal testimony, attempting to communicate something of the numinous reality he had encountered while remaining anchored in empirical psychology. The self stands as both the beginning and end of individuation, the hidden wholeness present from birth that seeks to realize itself through the vicissitudes of development, and the final goal toward which all the work of integration aims. It is the treasure hard to attain, the pearl of great price, the philosopher's stone, the kingdom of God within, the Buddha mind, by whatever name each tradition calls the experience of wholeness that reconciles all opposites and provides the ultimate meaning that consciousness alone can never supply. To orient oneself toward the self, rather than toward ego satisfaction or collective approval, is to undertake the journey Jung mapped, the path of individuation that leads through shadow and anima, or animus, through suffering and sacrifice, through death and rebirth, toward the realization of one's unique wholeness in service to the larger whole of humanity and cosmos. Dreams occupied a central place in Jung's psychology, not as disguised wish fulfillments requiring decoding through a master key of universal symbols, as Freud maintained, but as direct communications from the unconscious to consciousness, messages that compensated one-sided conscious attitudes, offered prospective guidance toward future possibilities, and revealed the current state of relationship between ego and the deeper psyche. Jung approached dreams with respect bordering on reverence, treating them as autonomous productions of the unconscious that possessed their own intelligence and purpose. that spoke a symbolic language consciousness must learn, rather than imposing reductive interpretations that forced dream content into predetermined theoretical categories. His disagreement with Freud over dream interpretation crystallized their theoretical differences and contributed significantly to their eventual rupture. Freud's method began with the assumption that dreams disguised unacceptable wishes, primarily sexual and aggressive impulses, that consciousness had repressed, and that the manifest content of the dream, what the dreamer actually experienced, concealed a latent content that could be discovered through free association and symbolic translation. The analyst's task was to penetrate the dream's defenses, to decode the symbolic substitutions and condensations, to arrive at the hidden wish that the dream simultaneously expressed and concealed. Freud provided a lexicon of universal symbols, snakes and towers representing phalluses, boxes and houses representing the womb and vagina, climbing stairs representing sexual intercourse, and so forth. Jung found this approach both brilliant and limiting. Brilliant in recognizing that dreams had meaning and could be investigated systematically, limiting in assuming that all dreams served the same function, that symbols had fixed meanings, and that the unconscious was merely reactive, producing dreams only in response to repression and conflict. His own clinical work suggested different conclusions. Many dreams seemed to have nothing to do with sexuality or repressed wishes, but addressed questions of meaning, spiritual development, creative potential, relationship to the self. Many symbols resisted reduction to sexual reference and made more sense when understood in their mythological, religious, or archetypal dimensions. Many dreams seemed oriented toward the future rather than the past, suggesting possibilities, warning of dangers, preparing consciousness for coming transitions. Jung developed a method of dream interpretation based on amplification rather than free association. Where Freud's technique had the dreamer associate to dream elements, following chains of personal association wherever they led, Jung's technique kept attention focused on the dream images themselves, elaborating their meanings through mythological, cultural, and archetypal parallels, while also attending to the dreamer's personal associations and current life situation. If a patient dreamed of a snake, Jung would not immediately translate this into a phallic symbol, but would ask what snakes meant to this particular dreamer, what role snakes played in mythology and religion, whether the snake appeared threatening or helpful, whether it connected to the dreamer's shadow or to healing and transformation, as in the caduceus or the serpent of Asclepius. This method assumed that dreams used images not arbitrarily, but for their inherent qualities, that a snake appeared as a snake because something about snakeness, about the cold-blooded chthonic creature that sheds its skin and represents both danger and wisdom, was relevant to the dreamer's psychological situation. The dream was not concealing meaning but revealing it, expressing in the most economical and powerful symbolic form the unconscious perspective on the dreamer's current state and future trajectory. The task was not to decode, but to understand, not to translate symbols into concepts, but to allow the symbolic images to work on consciousness, to sit with them, amplify them, let them unfold their meaning over time through active imagination and reflection. Jung distinguished between big dreams and little dreams. Little dreams dealt with everyday concerns, processed recent experiences, addressed minor adjustments in the personality, and often faded quickly from memory. Big dreams carried numinous weight, involved archetypal imagery, felt significant even when the dreamer could not articulate why, and remained vivid across decades. These big dreams occurred at crucial transitions, moments of crisis or transformation, and often anticipated future developments years before consciousness recognized them. Jung believed that big dreams came not from the personal unconscious, but from the collective unconscious, that they connected the individual to transpersonal patterns and meanings, and that they required special attention and care in interpretation. He emphasized the compensatory function of dreams, their tendency to balance one-sided conscious attitudes by presenting the opposite or neglected perspective. If consciousness was inflated, dreams brought humiliation and images of failure. If consciousness was too passive, dreams brought aggressive or assertive scenarios. If consciousness identified exclusively with persona and propriety, dreams revealed shadow content, criminal impulses, sexual adventures, everything the waking personality denied. This compensation served the self-regulating tendency of the psyche, preventing extremes, maintaining equilibrium, pushing consciousness toward greater wholeness through forcing attention to what it preferred to ignore. Dreams also served a prospective or teleological function, oriented toward future possibilities rather than merely processing past experience. A woman dreaming of pregnancy might be preparing psychologically for actual pregnancy, or the dream might anticipate a creative project, a new phase of life, the gestation of some potential seeking to be born. A man dreaming of descending into a cave might be receiving advance notice of an impending depression, or might be called toward necessary inner work, descent into the unconscious to retrieve lost aspects of personality. The prospective function meant dreams could not be fully understood until events unfolded, that their meaning emerged over time as the future they anticipated arrived in present experience. Jung advocated interpreting dreams in series rather than in isolation, observing how themes, images, and figures recurred and evolved across multiple dreams, tracing the unconscious ongoing commentary on the dreamer's individuation process. A series might show shadow figures gradually transforming from threatening to helpful, suggesting successful integration of shadow content. A series might show the anima evolving from seductress to spiritual guide, indicating development in the dreamer's relationship to the contrasexual archetype. A series might show increasingly frequent and elaborate mandala imagery, suggesting the self constellating more powerfully as the personality reorganized around a new center. He also introduced the concept of the dream ego, the figure in the dream who represents the dreamer's sense of self, often but not always identical with the waking ego's attitudes and capacities. Observing how the dream ego responds to dream situations revealed the ego's current strengths and limitations, its defensive patterns, its potential for growth. A dream ego who fled from shadow figures suggested an ego not yet ready for confrontation. A dream ego who engaged shadow figures in dialogue suggested greater maturity and willingness to integrate unconscious contents. A dream ego overwhelmed by archetypal figures suggested inflation or risk of possession. A dream ego who related to archetypal figures with both respect and autonomy suggested healthy ego-self axis. Jung made extensive use of dreams in his therapeutic practice, often spending entire sessions on a single dream, exploring its images through amplification, encouraging active imagination with dream figures, tracking how dream themes connected to the patient's life situation and individuation process. He saw dreams as the royal road to the unconscious, Freud's phrase, but with different implications, the most direct and reliable access to the unconscious perspective, more trustworthy than conscious self-reports because unmediated by ego defenses and social desirability. He collected and published hundreds of dream series, including his own dreams from childhood through old age, children's dreams that revealed archetypal themes emerging even before personal complexes had fully formed, and dreams of patients at various stages of analysis and life development. These collections demonstrated empirically the patterns he theorized, showed dreams spontaneously producing alchemical imagery, mythological parallels, archetypal sequences, compensatory corrections, prospective anticipations, all without the dreamer having conscious knowledge of the symbolic systems their dreams referenced. One of Jung's most important clinical discoveries was that dreams often produced images and themes identical to those found in alchemy, mythology, and religious texts, despite the dreamer having no conscious knowledge of these systems. A patient might dream of transforming base metal into gold, of passing through stages of dissolution and coagulation, of union between king and queen, all parallel in alchemical sequences the patient had never studied. Another patient might dream of death and resurrection, of descent to the underworld and return, of battles with dragons and rescue of captives, all repeating the hero's journey from mythologies they had never encountered. These parallels provided powerful evidence for the collective unconscious, suggesting that the psyche was structured by archetypal patterns that found expression in both cultural productions and individual dreams. Dreams of death often indicated not literal mortality, but psychological death, the end of an identity or life phase, making way for renewal and transformation. Dreams of pregnancy and birth similarly indicated psychological gestation, some new potential developing in the unconscious preparing to emerge into consciousness. Dreams of natural disasters, floods, earthquakes, fires suggested that the conscious attitude had become so rigid or one-sided that the unconscious was forced to use extreme imagery to get attention, that major psychological upheaval was necessary or imminent. Dreams of sacred spaces, temples, cathedrals, mandala-like structures indicated the self constellating, the personality reorganizing around the archetype of wholeness. Jung warned against mechanical interpretation, the reduction of dream symbols to fixed meanings, the application of dream dictionaries that claimed every image had one significance. Context was crucial, the dreamer's associations, life situation, stage of analysis, the relationship between dream images, the emotional tone, the outcome or lack thereof within the dream itself. The same image might mean different things for different dreamers or even for the same dreamer at different times. A snake might represent sexuality, unconscious wisdom, poison and danger, transformation and renewal, the self, depending on the dreamer's relationship to that symbol and the dream's total context. He also recognized that not all dreams required or rewarded interpretation, that some dreams simply processed the day's experiences, that others were too chaotic or fragmentary to yield meaning, that pursuing interpretation too aggressively could interfere with the unconscious natural processes. Sometimes it was enough to simply record a dream, to acknowledge it without forcing understanding, to trust that its meaning would emerge in time, or that it served functions not accessible to consciousness. The compulsion to interpret every dream reflected ego's need to control and understand, and learning to tolerate not knowing, to allow dreams their mystery, was itself part of the individuation process. Dreams in Jung's psychology were neither random neural firings nor disguised pathology, but genuine communications from an intelligent unconscious, messages that required learning to read symbolically, listening with respect, and understanding that consciousness does not have all the answers, that wisdom can come from depths, consciousness does not control, and that the psyche possesses resources for healing and transformation that transcend what ego alone can achieve. To work with dreams was to establish a living relationship with the unconscious, to engage in dialogue with the self, to participate consciously in the individuation process that unfolded whether consciousness attended to it or not, but that could unfold more harmoniously and creatively when consciousness cooperated rather than resisted or ignored the messages rising from the depths. This concludes the first part of our episode on Carl Jung, covering his life from childhood through the structure of the psyche, archetypes, shadow, anima, and animus, the self, and his understanding of dreams. Part 2 arrives next week, picking up with active imagination, psychological types, the individuation process, synchronicity, his engagement with religion and alchemy, and his controversial legacy. Consider subscribing so you don't miss it.